Scales of Justice by Ngaio Marsh. Read by Benedict Cumberbatch. Nurse Kettle pushed her bicycle to the top of Watts Hill and there paused. Sweating lightly, she looked down on the village of Swevenings. Smoke rose in cosy plumes from one or two chimneys. Roofs cuddled into surrounding greenery. The Chine, a trout stream, meandered through meadow and coppice and slid blamelessly under two bridges. It was a circumspect landscape. Not a faux pas, architectural or horticultural, marred the seemliness of the prospect. Really, Nurse Kettle thought with satisfaction, it is as pretty as a picture. And she remembered all the pretty pictures Lady Lacklander had made in irresolute watercolour, some from this very spot. She was reminded, too, of those illustrated maps that one finds in the underground, with houses, trees, and occupational figures amusingly dotted about them. Seen from above like this, Swevenings resembled such a map. Nurse Kettle looked down at the orderly pattern of field, hedge, stream, and land, and fancifully imposed upon it the curling labels and carefully naive figures that are proper to picture maps. From Watts Hill, Watts Lane ran steeply and obliquely into the valley. Between the lane and the Chine was contained a hillside divided into 3 strips, each garnished with trees, gardens, and a house of considerable age. These properties belonged to 3 of the principal householders of Swevenings: Mr. Danbury Finn, Commander Seiss, and Colonel Carteret. Nurse Kettle's map, she reflected, would have a little picture of Mr. Danbury Finn at Jacob's cottage, surrounded by his cats, and one of Commander Seiss at Uplands, shooting off his bow and arrow. Next door, at Hammer Farm, only it wasn't a farm now, but had been much converted, it would show Mrs. Carteret in a garden chair with a cocktail shaker, and Rose Carteret, her stepdaughter, gracefully weeding. Her attention sharpened. There, in point of fact, deep down in the actual landscape was Colonel Carteret himself, a Lilliputian figure moving along his rented stretch of the Chine, east of Bottom Bridge, and followed at a respectful distance by his spaniel Skip. His creel was slung over his shoulder, and his rod was in his hand. The evening rise, Nurse Kettle reflected. He's after the old un. And she added to her imaginary map the picture of an enormous trout lurking near Bottom Bridge. On the far side of the valley, on the private golf course at Nuns Pardon Manor, there would be Mr. George Lacklander, doing a solitary round with a glance, thought the gossip-loving Nurse Kettle, across the valley at Mrs. Carteret. Lacklander's son, Dr. Mark, would be shown with his black bag in his hand, and a stork, perhaps, quaintly flying overhead. And to complete, as it were, the gentry, there would be old Lady Lacklander, big-bottomed, on a sketching-stool, and her husband, Sir Harold, on a bed of sickness, alas, in his great room, the roof of which, after the manner of pictorial maps, had been removed to display him. In the map it would be demonstrated how Watts Lane, wandering to the right and bending back again, neatly divided the gentry from what Nurse Kettle called the ordinary folk. To the west lay the Danbury Finn, the Seiss, the Carteret, and above all the Lacklander domains. Neatly disposed along the east margin of Watts Lane were 5 conscientiously preserved thatched cottages, the village shop, and across Monk's Bridge the church and rectory and the Boy and Donkey. And that was all. No pulls in for Carmen, no oldie bunny shoppies which Nurse Kettle had learned to despise, no spurious half-timbering marred the perfection of Swevenings. Nurse Kettle, bringing her panting friends up to the top of Watts Hill, would point with her little finger at the valley and observe triumphantly, "Where every prospect pleases," without completing the quotation, because in Swevenings not even man was vile. Nurse Kettle mounted her bicycle and began to coast down Watts Lane. On her left appeared the quickset hedge of Jacob's cottage. From the far side came the voice of Mr. Octavius Danbury Finn. "Adorable," Mr. Danbury Finn was saying. "Queen of delight. Fish!" He was answered by the trill of feline voices. Nurse Kettle brought herself to anchor at the gate. "Good evening," she said. There was Mr. Danbury Finn in his Elizabethan garden giving supper to his cats. He wore a smoking cap, tasselled, embroidered with beads and falling to pieces. On top of this was perched a pair of ready-made reading glasses, which he now removed and gaily waved at her. "You appear," he said, "like some exotic deity mounted on an engine quaintly devised by Inigo Jones. Good evening to you, Nurse Kettle. Pray, what has become of your automobile?" "She's having a spot of beauty treatment and a minor op. And how's the world treating you, feeding your kitties, I see?" "The persons of the house," Mr. Finn acquiesced. "Now, as you observe, sup. What errand of therapeutic mercy has set you darkling in the saddle? What pain and anguish wring which brow?" "Well, I've one or two calls," said Nurse Kettle, "but the long and the short of me is that I'm on my way to spend the night at the big house, relieving with the old gentleman, you know." She looked across the valley to Nun's Pardon Manor. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Finn softly. "Dear me. May one inquire, is Sir Harold—" "He's 75, said Nurse Kettle briskly, "and he's very tired. Still, you never know with cardiacs, he may perk up again. There now, gossiping again. Talking of gossip, I see the Colonel's out for the evening rise." An extraordinary change at once took place in Mr. Finn. His face became suffused with purple, his eyes glittered, and he bared his teeth in a canine grin. "A hideous curse upon his sport," he said. "It is a dreadful thing to say about a fellow creature, a shocking thing, but I do say advisedly and deliberately that I suspect Colonel Carteret of having recourse to improper practices." "I'm sure I do not know to what you refer," said Nurse Kettle. "Bread! Worms!" said Mr. Finn, spreading his arms. "Anything! Tickling, even! I put it as low as that." "I'm sure you're mistaken." "It is not my habit, Miss Kettle, to mistake the wanton extravagances of infatuated humankind. Look, if you will, at Carteret's associates. Look if your stomach is strong enough to sustain the experience at Commander Seiss." "Good gracious me, what has the poor commander done?" "That man, that intemperate filibuster who divides his leisure between alcohol and the idiotic pursuit of archery, that ward-room Cupid, my God, murdered the mother of Thomasina Twitchett. Not deliberately, I'm sure." Mr. Finn leant over his garden gate and grasped the handlebars of Nurse Kettle's bicycle. "In the cool of the evening, Madame Thorns, for such was her name, was wont to promenade in the bottom meadow. Being great with kit, she presented a considerable target. Seiss, flushed no doubt with wine, and flattering himself he cut the devil of a figure, is to be pictured upon his archery lawn. The instrument of destruction, a bow, with the drawing power, I am told, of 60 pounds, is in his grip, and the lust of blood in his heart. He shot an arrow in the air," Mr. Finn concluded, "and if you tell me that it fell to earth he knew not where, I shall flatly refuse to believe you. His target, his deliberate mark, I am persuaded, was my exquisite cat. Thomasina, my fur of furs, I am speaking of your mamma." The cat blinked at Mr. Finn, and so did Nurse Kettle. "I must say," she thought, "he really is a little off, living alone with only those cats. It's not to be wondered at, really." She gave him her brightest professional smile and one of her standard valedictions. "Ah, well," she said, letting go her anchorage on the gate. "Be good, and if you can't be good, be careful." "Care," Mr. Danbury Finn countered with a look of real intemperance in his eye. "Killed the cat. Good evening to you, Nurse Kettle." Mr. Finn was a widower, but Commander Seiss was a bachelor. He lived next to Mr. Finn in a Georgian house called Uplands. He was looked after by an ex-naval rating and his wife. The greater part of the grounds had been allowed to run to seed, but the kitchen garden was kept up by the married couple and the archery lawn by Commander Seiss himself. At one end, in fine weather, stood a target on an easel, and at the other, on summer evenings, from as far away as Nun's Pardon, Commander Seiss could be observed in the classic pose, shooting around from his 60-pound bow. He was reputed to be a fine marksman, and it was noticed that however much his gait might waver, his stance, once he had opened his chest and stretched his bow, was that of a rock. As Nurse Kettle approached the house, she heard the sound of steps on the gravel, and saw him limping away round the far end, his bow in his hand. "Hi," she called out brightly. "Good evening, Commander." Seiss turned, hesitated for a moment, and then came towards her. He was a fairish, sunburned man who had run to seed. He still reeked of the Navy and, as Nurse Kettle noticed when he drew nearer, of whiskey. His eyes, blue and bewildered, stared into hers.
"Sorry," he said rapidly. "Good evening. Beg your pardon."
"Dr. Mark," she said, "asked me to drop in while I was passing and leave your prescription for you. There we are. The mixture as before." He took it from her with a darting movement of his hand.
"Most awfully kind," he said. "Frightfully sorry. Nothing urgent."
"No bother at all," Nurse Kettle rejoined. "I'm calling in at Hammer. Perhaps you won't mind my trespassing. There's a footpath down to the right of way, isn't there?"
"Of course. Please do."
They came out on the archery lawn and upon a surprising and lovely view over the valley of the Chine. "What a clear evening," Nurse Kettle exclaimed with pleasure. "And how close everything looks. I've been told that once upon a time you hit a mark you didn't bargain for down there." Seiss stopped dead. She saw that beads of sweat had formed on the back of his neck. Alcoholic, she thought, flabby. Shame, must have been a fine man when he looked after himself.
"Great grief!"
Seiss cried out, thumping his fist on the seat of her bicycle.
"You mean the bloody cat?"
"Well,
great grief, it was an accident. I've told the perisher. An accident. I like cats."
His eyes were misted and his lips trembled. "We all make mistakes," said Nurse Kettle comfortably. He pointed to a little gate at the end of the path.
"There's the gate into Hammer," he said, and added with exquisite awkwardness, "I beg your pardon. I'm very poor company, as you see. Thank you for bringing the stuff. Thank you.
"Much obliged for the assistance. Good evening to you." She pushed her bicycle through the gate into the well-tended coppice belonging to Hammer Farm, and in the direction of the Carteret's rose garden, where she could hear the snip of garden secateurs and a woman's voice quietly singing. A man's voice joined in, making a second part of the words, come away, death, and in sad cypress let me be laid." Nurse Kettle approached a green archway, and as she did so the woman's voice broke off from its song and said, "That's my favourite of all." "Strange," said the man. "Strange, isn't it, in a comedy to make the love song so sad? Don't you think so, Rose?" "Rose? Darling." Nurse Kettle tinkled her bell, passed through the green archway and looked to her right. She discovered Miss Rose Carteret and Dr. Mark Lacklander gazing into each other's eyes with unmistakable significance. Dr. Lacklander blushed to the roots of his hair and said, "Good God! Good heavens! Good evening!" And Miss Carteret said, "Oh, hello, nurse, good evening." She too blushed, but more delicately than Dr. Lacklander. Nurse Kettle said, "Good evening, Miss Rose. Good evening, Doctor. Hope it's all right, my taking the short cut." Nurse Kettle was a romantic woman and took pleasure in the look of excitement on Dr. Lacklander's face and of shyness on Rose's. "Nurse Kettle," Dr. Lacklander said rapidly, "like a perfect angel, is going to look after my grandfather tonight. I don't know what we should have done without her. And, by the same token," Nurse Kettle added, "I'd better go on my way." They smiled and nodded at her. "Well," she thought, "if that's not a case, I've never seen young love before. Blow me down flat, but I never guessed. Fancy!" When her figure, stoutly clad in her district nurse's uniform, had bobbed its way out of the enclosed garden, Rose Carteret and Mark Lacklander looked at each other and laughed nervously. Mark Lacklander said unsteadily, "Darling, don't," Rose said. "Honestly, don't." "No? Are you warning me off, Rose? Is it all a dead loss?" She made a small, ineloquent gesture, tried to speak and said nothing. "Well," Lacklander said, "I may as well tell you that I was going to ask you if you'd marry me. I love you very dearly, and I thought we seemed to sort of suit. Was I wrong about that?" "No," Rose said. "Well then?" "I can't think of getting engaged, much less married.
You could see what it's like here, I mean the domestic setup. You must have seen for yourself how much difference it makes to Daddy my being on tap. His second marriage hasn't been a success. If I left him now, he'd really and truly have nothing to live for, really."
"Nonsense," Mark said. "I won't be put off, Rose. You shall marry me, and if your father's life here is too unsatisfactory, well, he could come to us."
"Never. Don't you see? He couldn't bear it. He'd feel sort of extraneous.
I'm going to talk to him. I shall tell him I want to marry you."
"No, Mark, darling, no. Please."
His hand closed momentarily over hers. Then he was on his feet and had taken up the basket of roses.
"Good evening, Mrs. Carteret," he said. "We're robbing your garden for my grandmother.
You're very much ahead of us at Hammer with your roses." Kitty Carteret had turned in by the green archway and was looking thoughtfully at them. The second Mrs. Carteret did not match her Edwardian name. She did not look like a Kitty. She was so fair that without her makeup she would have seemed bleached. Her figure was well disciplined, and her face had been skillfully drawn up into a beautifully cared-for mask. Her greatest asset was her acquired inscrutability. This, of itself, made a femme fatale of Kitty Carteret.
"How nice to see you, Mark," she said. "I thought I heard your voices."
She moved up to him and with her gloved hand took a dark rose from the basket and held it against her mouth.
"What a smell," she said. "Almost improper, it's so strong. Morris is not in, but he won't be long. Shall we go up?"
She led the way to the house. Exotic wafts of something that was not roses drifted in her wake. She kept her torso rigid as she walked and slightly swayed her hips. Very expensive, Mark Lacklander thought, but not entirely exclusive. Why on earth did he marry her? Mrs. Carteret's pin heels tapped along the flagstone path to a group of garden furniture heaped with cushions. A tray with a decanter and brandy glasses was set out on the white iron table. She let herself down on a swinging seat, put up her feet, and arranged herself for Mark to look at.
"Poorest Rose," she said, glancing at her stepdaughter. "You're wearing such suitable gloves. Do cope with your scratchy namesakes for Mark. A box, perhaps?"
"Please don't bother," Mark said. "I'll take them as they are."
"We can't allow that," Mrs. Carteret murmured. "You doctors mustn't scratch your lovely hands, you know."
Colonel Carteret emerged from a spinney halfway down the hill, followed by his spaniel Skip, an old, obedient dog. When he saw the group by the lawn, he lifted his hand in greeting. Mark went down to meet him.
"Good evening, Mark," he called. "My dear chap, what do you think? I've damn near bagged the Olden."
"No!" Mark shouted with appropriate enthusiasm.
"I assure you, the Olden, below the bridge in his usual lurk, you know. I could see him."
And as he panted up the hill, the colonel completed his classic tale of a magnificent strike, a Homeric struggle, and a broken cast. The Olden was famous in Swevenings, a trout of magnitude and cunning, the despair and desire of every rod in the district.
"So I lost him," the colonel ended, opening his eyes very wide. "What a thing! By Jove, if I'd got him, I really believe old Finn would have murdered me. The chap's impossible, you know. How's your grandfather?"
Mark said, "He's failing pretty rapidly, I'm afraid. It's on his account that I'm here, sir." And he delivered his message.
"I'll come at once," the colonel said.
Sir Harold Lacklander watched Nurse Kettle as she moved about his room. He knew that he was dying. His grandson had not told him in so many words, but he had read the fact of death in the boy's face and in the behaviour of his own wife and son.
"Long time,"
he said. He used as few words as possible because with every one he uttered, it was as if he squandered a measure of his dwindling capital. Nurse Kettle placed herself where he could see her and hear her easily, and said, "Dr. Mark says the Colonel will be here quite soon. He's been fishing."
"Luck?"
"I don't know. He'll tell you."
"Olden."
"Ah," said Nurse Kettle comfortably. "They won't catch him in a hurry." The wraith of a chuckle drifted up from the bed and was followed by an anxious sigh. She looked closely at the face that seemed during that day to have receded from its own bones. "All right?" she asked. The lackluster eyes searched hers. "Papers?" the voice asked. "I found them just where you said. They're on the table over there." "Here." "If it makes you feel more comfortable." She moved into the shadows at the far end of the great room and returned carrying a package tied and sealed, which she put on his bedside table. "Memoirs," he whispered. The door opened, and Mark Lacklander came into the room, followed by Colonel Carteret. "Here's the Colonel, Grandfather."
"Hello, Carteret,"
said Sir Harold so loudly and clearly that Nurse Kettle made a little exclamation.
"Nice of you to come."
"Hello, sir," said the Colonel. "Sorry you're feeling so cheap. Mark says you want to see me."
"Yes."
The eyes turned towards the bedside table.
"Those things,"
he said.
"Take them, will you? Now."
"They're the memoirs," Mark said. "Do you want me to read them?" Carteret asked, stooping over the bed.
"If you will."
There was a pause. Mark put the package into Colonel Carteret's hands. The old man's eyes watched in what seemed to be an agony of interest. "I think," Mark said, "that Grandfather hopes you will edit the memoirs, sir."
Of course, I'll be delighted, if you think you can trust me." "Trust you? Implicitly. Implicitly. One other thing. Do you mind, Mark?"
"Of course not, Grandfather. Nurse, shall we have a word?" Nurse Kettle followed Mark out of the room. They stood together on a dark landing at the head of a wide stairway. In the hall below, a door opened and light flooded up the stairs. Mark looked over the banister and saw the enormously broad figure of his grandmother. She began heavily to ascend. He could hear her laboured breathing. "Steady does it, Gar," he said. Lady Lacklander paused and looked up.
"Ha!" she said. "It's the doctor, is it?"
Mark grinned at the sardonic overtone. She arrived on the landing. The train of her old velvet dinner dress followed her, and the diamonds, which every evening she absent-mindedly stuck about her enormous bosom, burned and winked as it rose and fell.
"Good evening, Kettle," she panted. "Good of you to come and help my poor old boy. Why are you both closeted together out here?"
"The Colonel's here, Gar. Grandfather wanted to have a word privately with him."
"Something about those damned memoirs,"
said Lady Lacklander vexedly. There was a large Jacobean chair on the landing. She let herself down into it, shuffling her astonishingly small feet out of a pair of old slippers. Colonel Carteret opened the door. "Can you come, Mark? Quickly." Mark went past him into the bedroom. Lady Lacklander had risen and followed with more celerity than he would have thought possible. A tall man in evening clothes came hurrying up the stairs. Lady Lacklander was already at her husband's bedside.
"I'm here, Hal,"
she said. Nurse Kettle had appeared with a glass in her hand. "Brandy. Old-fashioned but good." "I'll give an injection," Mark said. He turned away and found himself face to face with his father.
"Can I do anything?"
George Lacklander asked.
"Here's George, Hal," Lady Lacklander said. "We're all here with you, my dear."
From behind the mask against Nurse Kettle's shoulder came a stutter.
"Vic, Vic."
As if the pulse that was soon to run down had become semi-articulate like a clock.
"The vicar?"
Lady Lacklander asked, pressing his hand and bending over him.
"Do you want the vicar to come, Hal?"
His eyes stared up into hers. Something like a smile twitched at the corners of the gaping mouth. The head moved slightly. Mark came back with the syringe and gave the injection. After a moment, Nurse Kettle turned away. Lady Lacklander and her son and grandson drew closer to the bed. She had taken her husband's hands.
"What is it, Hal? What is it, my dearest?"
she asked.
"Is it the vicar?"
With a distinctness that astonished them, he whispered,
"After all, you never know."
and with his gaze still fixed on his wife, he then died. On the late afternoon, 3 days after his father's funeral, Sir George Lacklander sat in the study at Nun's Pardon going through the contents of the files and the desk. He was a handsome man, grizzled in a most becoming way, with grey wings at his temples and a plume above his forehead. He was 50 years old and remarkably vigorous. Sir Harold had left everything in apple-pie order, and his son anticipated little trouble. As he turned over the pages of his father's diaries, the butler came in to say that Colonel Carteret had called and would like to see him. "Hello, Morris," he said when the Colonel came in. "Glad to see you. Anything wrong?" "Well, yes," the Colonel said. "I'm sorry to bother you, George, but the truth is I'm so damn worried that I feel I've got to share my responsibility with you." The Colonel took 2 envelopes from his pocket and laid them on the desk. Sir George saw that they were addressed in his father's writing. "Read the letter first," the Colonel said, indicating the smaller of the 2 envelopes. George gave him a wondering look. He screwed in his eyeglass, drew a single sheet of paper from the envelope, and began to read. As he did so, his mouth fell gently open and his expression grew increasingly blank. "I don't understand a word of it," he said. "You will, when you've looked at this." The Colonel drew a thin sheaf of manuscript out of the larger envelope. George gave him a wondering look and began to read again. He was a rubicund man, but the fresh colour drained out of his face. His mouth lost its firmness, and his eyes their assurance. "It's not true," he said. "We've always known what happened. It was well known." "I'm damn sorry, George," Colonel Carteret said. "I've thought it over very carefully. He's left the decision with me, and I've decided I must publish this. I must, George. Any other course would be impossible." But have you thought what it will do to us?" "I know, believe me, George, I know how painful and distressing this will be to you all. If I could chuck it away or burn it with anything like a clear conscience, I would." He returned the envelope to the breast pocket of his coat. "You're free, of course," he said, "to talk this over with Lady Lacklander and Mark. I've brought a copy of his letter." The Colonel produced a 3rd envelope, laid it on the desk, and moved towards the door. "And George," he said, "I beg you to believe me, I am sorry. I'm deeply sorry. If I could see any other way, I'd thankfully take it." "What?" George Lacklander had made an inarticulate noise. He now pointed a heavy finger at the Colonel. "After this," he said, "I needn't tell you that any question of an understanding between your girl and my boy is at an end." "I didn't know," the Colonel said at last, "that there was any question of an understanding. If Mark has told you—" "Who says Mark told me? The full, rather florid voice faltered and petered out. "Indeed," the Colonel said. "Then may I ask where you got your information?" They stared at each other, and curiously the look of startled conjecture which had appeared on George Lacklander's face was reflected on the Colonel's. "Couldn't matter less in any case," the Colonel said. "Your informant, I am sure, is entirely mistaken. Goodbye." Colonel Carteret went home by the right-of-way known as the river path. The Colonel was feeling miserable. He was weighed down by his responsibility and upset by his falling out with George Lacklander, who, pompous old ass though the Colonel thought him, was a lifetime friend. Worst of all, he was wretchedly disturbed by the suggestion that Rose had fallen in love with Mark, and by the inference, which he couldn't help drawing, that George Lacklander had collected this information from the Colonel's wife. He came to the foot of the hill and to Bottom Bridge. The bridge divided his fishing from Mr. Danbury Finn's. He had the lower reaches and Mr. Finn the upper. The Colonel crossed from Mr. Finn's side to his own, folded his arms on the stone parapet, and gazed into the sliding green world beneath. At first he stared absently, but after a moment his attention sharpened. In the left bank of the Chine, near a broken-down boat-shed where an old punt was moored, there was a hole. In its depths eddied and lurked a shadow among shadows. The Olden. Perhaps, the Colonel thought, perhaps it would ease my mind a bit if I came down before dinner. He may stay on my side. The Colonel walked slowly on and eventually turned up through the spinney into the open field below his own lawn. His wife was in her hammock, dangling a tightly encased black velvet leg, a flame-coloured sleeve, and a pair of enormous earrings. The cocktail tray was ready on her iron table. "How late you are," she said idly. "Dinner in half an hour. What have you been up to at Nun's Pardon?" "Out to see George about some business." "How illuminating." "It was private, my dear," the Colonel said miserably and went indoors. If he hadn't been so rattled and worried, he would no doubt have given some sort of warning of his approach. As it was, he crossed the heavy carpet of the hall, opened the drawing-room door, and discovered his daughter locked in Mark Lacklander's arms, from which embrace she was making but ineffectual attempts to escape. Rose and Mark behaved in the classic manner of surprised lovers. They released each other. Rose turned white and Mark red, and neither of them uttered a word. The Colonel said, "I'm sorry, my dear. Forgive me," and made his daughter a little bow. Rose, with a sort of agitated spontaneity, ran to him, linked her hands behind his head, and cried, "It had to happen sometime, darling, didn't it?" Mark said, "Sir, I want her to marry me." "But I won't," Rose said. "I won't unless you can be happy about it. I've told him." The Colonel looked from his daughter to her lover, and thought how ardent and vulnerable they seemed. "Sit down, both of you," he said. "I've got to think what I'm going to say to you. Sit down." They obeyed him with an air of bewilderment. "When you go back to Nun's Pardon, Mark," he said, "you will find your father very much upset. That is because of a talk I've just had with him. It's not good news. You will find him entirely opposed to any thought of your marriage with Rose." "I can't believe it," Mark said, and stood up. He turned to Rose. "Don't be fussed, darling. I'll go home and sort it out." The Colonel took Mark by the arm and led him to the door. "You won't feel very friendly towards me tomorrow, Mark," he said. "Will you try to believe that the action I've been compelled to take is one that I detest taking?" "Compelled?" Mark repeated. "Yes, well, yes, of course." He stuck out the Lacklander jaw and knitted the Lacklander brows. "Look here, sir. If my father welcomes our engagement, and I can't conceive of his doing anything else, will you have any objection? I'd better tell you now that no objection on either side will make the smallest difference." "In that case," the Colonel said, "your question is academic." He held out his hand. "Goodbye, Mark." By 8 o'clock the evening depression had begun to settle over Commander Seiss. At about 5 o'clock, when the sun was over the yardarm, he had a brandy and soda. This raised his spirits. With its successors, up to the 3rd or 4th, they rose still farther. During this period, he saw himself taking a job and making a howling success of it. From that emotional eminence he fell away with each succeeding dram, and it was during his decline that he usually took to archery. It had been in such a state of almost suicidal depression that he had suddenly shot an arrow over his coppice into Mr. Danbury Finn's bottom meadow and slain the mother of Thomasina Twitchett. Tonight, the onset of depression was more than usually severe. His married couple were on their annual holiday, and he had not been bothered to do anything about an evening meal. He found his arrow and limped back to the archery lawn. He no longer wanted to shoot. His gammy leg ached, but he thought he'd take a turn up the drive. When he arrived at the top, it was to discover Nurse Kettle seated by the roadside in gloomy contemplation of her bicycle, which stood upside down on its saddle and handlebars. "Hello, Commander," said Nurse Kettle. "I've got a puncture." "Evening. Really? Ball for you." Seiss shot out at her. "I'm going to have a shot at running repairs." Seiss watched her make a pass with a lever at her tire. "Not like that," he shouted, when he could no longer endure it. "And in any case, you want a bucket of water to find the puncture." She looked helplessly at him. "Here," he mumbled. "Give it here." He righted the bicycle, and with a completely inaudible remark began to wheel it down his drive. Nurse Kettle followed. Commander Seiss wheeled the bicycle into a gardener's shed, and without the slightest attempt at any further conversation, set about the removal of the tire. Nurse Kettle hitched herself up on a bench and watched him. Presently she began to talk.
I am obliged to you. Epidemic in the village, odd cases all over the place, and then this happens. There, aren't you neat-fingered? I looked at a nun's pardon this evening, she continued. Lady Lacklander's got a toe, and Dr. Mark arranged for me to do the fomentations.
Commander Seiss repaired the puncture and replaced the tube and tire. When he had finished and made as if to stand up, he gave a sharp cry of pain, clapped his hand to the small of his back, and sank down again on his knees.
Hello? Nurse Kettle ejaculated. What's all this? Bago?
Commander Seiss swore under his breath.
Most frightfully sorry, he groaned. Excuse me.
It was now that Nurse Kettle showed the quality that caused people to prefer her to grander and more up-to-date nurses. To Commander Seiss's conjurations to leave him alone, followed in the extremity of his pain by furious oaths, she paid no attention. She went down on all fours beside him, enticed him and aided him towards the bench, encouraged him to use it and her own person as aids to rising, and finally had him, although almost bent double, on his feet. She helped him into the house, and lowered him down on a sofa in a dismal drawing-room.
Down a bumps, she said.
Sweating and gasping, he reclined there and glared at her.
Now, what are we going to do about you, I wonder? Did I or did I not see a rug in the hall? Wait a bit.
She went out and came back with a rug and covered him up, went out again and returned with a glass of water.
Here's a couple of aspirin to go on with, said Nurse Kettle.
He took them without looking at her.
Please, don't trouble,
he groaned.
Thank you. Under my own steam.
She gave him a look and went out again. In her absence he attempted to get up, but was galvanized with the monstrous jab of lumbago and subsided in agony. He began to think she had gone for good when she came in with 2 hot water bags.
At this stage, she said, heat's the ticket.
Where'd you get those things?
Borrowed 'em from the Carterets.
My God!
She laid them against his back.
Dr. Mark's coming to look at you, she said.
My God!
He was at the Carterets, and if you ask me, there's going to be some news from that quarter before any of us are much older.
To his horror, she began to take off his shoes.
With a yo-heave-ho, said Nurse Kettle out of compliment to the Navy. Like a cup of tea? She asked.
No, thank you.
Well, it won't be anything stronger unless the doctor says so.
He reddened, caught her eye, and grinned.
Come, she said, that's better.
I'm really ashamed to trouble you so much.
I might have said the same about my bike, mightn't I?
She bustled out again and came back with Mark Lacklander. The examination was brief.
If the lumbago doesn't clear up, we can do something a bit more drastic, Mark said. But in the meantime, Nurse Kettle will get you to bed.
Good God!
And look in again tomorrow morning. When he had gone, Nurse Kettle said cheerfully,
Well, you'll have to put up with me, it seems.
Half an hour later, when he was propped up in bed with a cup of hot milk and a plate of bread and butter, and the lamp within easy reach, Nurse Kettle looked down at him with her quizzical air.
Well, she said, I shall now, as they say, love you and leave you.
Thank you,
gabbled Commander Seiss nervously.
Thank you.
She had plodded over to the door before his voice arrested her.
I don't suppose, he said, that you are familiar with Aubrey's brief lives, are you?
No, she said. Who was he when he was at home?
He wrote a brief life of a man called Sir Jonas Moore. It begins, sciatica, he cured it by boiling his buttocks. I'm glad at least you don't propose to try that remedy.
Well, cried Nurse Kettle delightedly, you are coming out of your shell to be sure. Nighty-bye.
During the next 3 days, Nurse Kettle, peddling about her duties, had occasion to notice, and she was sharp in such matters, that something untoward was going on in the district. Wherever she went, whether it was to attend upon Lady Lacklander's toe, or upon the abscess of the gardener's child at Hammer, or upon Commander Syce's strangely persistent lumbago, she felt a kind of heightened tension in the behaviour of her patients, and also in the behaviour of young Dr. Mark Lacklander. Rose Carteret, when she encountered her in the garden, was white and jumpy. The Colonel looked strained, and Mrs. Carteret singularly excited.
"Kettle,"
Lady Lacklander said on Wednesday, wincing a little as she endured the approach of a fermentation to her toe.
"Tell me, is there any gossip in the village about my grandson? Romantic gossip?"
"A bit," Nurse Kettle said, and after a pause added, "It'd be lovely, wouldn't it? She's a sweet girl, and an heiress into the bargain."
"Oof. You go past Hammer on your way home, don't you?"
Nurse Kettle said she did.
"I've written a note to Colonel Carteret. Drop it there like a good creature, will you?"
Nurse Kettle said she would, and fetched it from Lady Lacklander's writing desk.
"It's a pity,"
Lady Lacklander muttered, as Nurse Kettle was about to leave her.
"It's a pity poor George is such an ass."
She considered that George gave only too clear a demonstration of being an ass when she caught a glimpse of him on the following evening. He was playing a round of golf with Mrs. Carteret. George had fallen into a muddled, excited dotage upon Kitty Carteret. She told him repeatedly how chivalrous he was, and so cast a glow of knight-errantry over impulses that are not usually seen in that light. She allowed him only the most meagre rewards, doling out the lesser stimulants of courtship in positively homeopathic doses. Thus, on the Nun's Pardon golf course, he was allowed to watch, criticize, and correct her swing. Lady Lacklander, tramping down River Path in the cool of the evening, with a footman in attendance to carry her sketching impedimenta and her shooting stick, observed her son and his pupil, as it were, in pantomime on the second tee. The two figures disappeared over the crest of the hill, and Lady Lacklander plodded heavily on in great distress of mind. Because of her ulcerated toe, she wore a pair of her late husband's shooting boots. She and the footman reached Bottom Bridge, turned left, and came to a halt before a group of alders, and the prospect of a bend in the stream. The footman set up her easel, filled her water jar at the stream, placed her camp stool, and put her shooting stick beside it. When she fell back from her work in order to observe it as a whole, Lady Lacklander was in the habit of supporting her bulk upon the shooting stick. The footman left her. She would reappear in her own time at Nun's Pardon and change for dinner at 9 o'clock. The footman would return and collect her impedimenta. She fixed her spectacles on her nose, directed at her subject the sort of glance Nurse Kettle often bestowed on a recalcitrant patient, and set to work, massive and purposeful, before her easel. It was at 6:30 that she established herself there, in the meadow on the left bank of the Chine, not far below Bottom Bridge. At 7, Mr. Danbury Finn, having assembled his paraphernalia for fishing, set off down Watts Hill. He did not continue to Bottom Bridge, but turned left and made for the upper reaches of the Chine. At 7, Mark Lacklander, having looked in on a patient in the village, set off on foot along Watts Lane. He carried his case of instruments, as he wished to lance the abscess of the gardener's child at Hammer, and his racket and shoes as he proposed to play tennis with Rose Carteret. He also hoped to have an extremely serious talk with her father. At 7, Nurse Kettle, having delivered Lady Lacklander's note at Hammer, turned in at Commander Syce's drive and free-wheeled to his front door. At 7, Sir George Lacklander, finding himself favourably situated in a sheltered position behind a group of trees, embraced Mrs. Carteret with determination, fervour, and an ulterior motive. At Hammer, Rose and her father sat in his study and gazed at each other in dismay.
"When did Mark tell you?" Colonel Carteret asked.
"On that same night. He went to Nun's Pardon, and his father told him, and then he came back here and told me. Daddy, you do understand, don't you, that theoretically Mark is absolutely on your side, and I agree too, absolutely, other things being equal."
"Ah," said the Colonel.
"But they're not, darling," Rose cried out. "They're nothing like equal. In terms of human happiness, they're all cockeyed. Mark says his grandmother's so desperately worried that with all this coming on top of Sir Harold's death and everything, she may crack up altogether."
Rose went to the window and looked down.
"She's down there somewhere," she said, "sketching in Bottom Meadow. She only sketches when she's fussed."
"She sent me a chit. She wants me to go and talk to her at 8 o'clock, when I suppose she'll have done a sketch and hopes to feel less fussed. Damned inconvenient hour, but there you are."
"And of course," Rose added, "Mark's papa, he's cutting up most awfully rough and—"
Rose caught back her breath. Her lips trembled and her eyes filled with tears. She launched herself into her father's arms and burst into a flood of tears.
"My poor baby," murmured the agitated and sentimental Colonel. "My poor baby."
He dabbed at her eyes with his own handkerchief, kissed her, and put her aside.
"Nothing to be gained by any further delay. I'll go now."
He went to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and took out an envelope. Then he went to call on Mr. Octavius Danbury Finn. Lady Lacklander consulted the diamond-encrusted watch which was pinned to her tremendous bosom, and discovered that it was now 7 o'clock. She rose from her stool, tramped some distance away to the crest of a hillock, seated herself on her shooting stick, and contemplated her work through a lorgnette tricked out with diamonds. The shooting stick sank beneath her in the soft meadowland so that the disc, which was designed to check its descent, was itself embedded to the depth of several inches. When Lady Lacklander returned to her easel, she merely abandoned her shooting stick, which remained in a vertical position, and from a distance looked a little like a giant fungoid growth. Sticking up above intervening hillocks and rushes, it was observed over the top of his glasses by the long-sighted Mr. Finn when, accompanied by Thomasina Twitchett, he came nearer to Bottom Bridge. Keeping on the right bank, he began to cast his fly in a somewhat mannered but adroit fashion over the waters most often frequented by the Olden. Lady Lacklander, whose ears were as sharp as his, heard the whir of his reel, and remaining invisible was perfectly able to deduce the identity and movements of the angler. At the same time, far above them on Watts Hill, Colonel Carteret, finding nobody but 7 cats at home at Jacob's cottage, walked round the house, and looking down into the little valley at once spotted both Lady Lacklander and Mr. Finn, like figures in Nurse Kettle's imaginary map, the one squatting on her camp stool, the other in slow motion near Bottom Bridge.
"I've time to speak to him before I see her," thought the Colonel, "but I'll leave it here in case we don't meet."
He posted his long envelope in Mr. Finn's front door, and then, greatly troubled in spirit, he made for the river path and went down into the valley, the old spaniel Skip walking at his heels. Nurse Kettle, looking through the drawing-room window at Uplands, caught sight of the Colonel before he disappeared beyond Commander Syce's spinney. She administered a final tattoo with the edges of her muscular hands on Commander Syce's lumbar muscles, and bustled away to wash her hands. When she returned, Syce was sitting on the edge of his improvised bed. He wore slacks, a shirt, a scarf, and a dressing gown.
"I hope you will give me the pleasure of joining me for a drink before you go."
They had their drinks, looking at each other with an air of comradeship. Commander Syce got out an album of photographs taken when he was on the active list in the Navy. Nurse Kettle adored photographs, and was genuinely interested in a long sequence of naval vessels, odd groups of officers, and views of seaports. Presently she turned a page and discovered quite a dashing watercolour of a corvette, and then an illustrated menu with lively little caricatures in the margin. These she greatly admired, and observing a terrified and defiant expression on the face of her host, ejaculated, "You never did these yourself."
"You did? Well, aren't you the clever one?"
Without answering, he produced a small portfolio which he silently thrust at her. It contained many more sketches. Although Nurse Kettle knew nothing about pictures, she did, she maintained, know what she liked, and she liked these very much indeed. They were direct statements of facts, and she awarded them direct statements of approval, and was about to shut the portfolio when a sketch that had faced the wrong way round caught her attention. She turned it over. It was of a woman lying on a chaise longue, smoking a cigarette in a jade holder.
"Why,"
Nurse Kettle ejaculated,
"why, that's Mrs. Carteret."
Syce said very rapidly,
"Party, metaphores, surely, forgotten all about it."
"That would be before they were married, wouldn't it?"
Nurse Kettle remarked with perfect simplicity. She shut the portfolio, said, "You know, I believe you could make my picture map of Swevenings," and told him of her great desire for one. When she got up and collected her belongings, he too rose, but with an ejaculation of distress. "See? I haven't made a job of you yet," she remarked. "Same time tomorrow suit you?"
"Admirably," he said. "Thank you, thank you, thank you."
He gave her one of his rare, painful smiles, and watched her as she walked down the path towards his spinney. It was now 9:15. Nurse Kettle had left her bicycle in the village where she was spending the evening with the Women's Institute. She therefore took the river path and followed a rough path along the right bank of the Chine, past a group of alders and another of willows. As sometimes happens when we are solitary, she had the sensation of being observed, but she was not a fanciful woman and soon dismissed this feeling. "It's turned much cooler," she thought. A cry of mourning, intolerably loud, rose from beyond the willows and hung on the night air. A thrush whirred out of the thicket close to her face, and the cry broke and wavered again. It was the howl of a dog. She pushed through the thicket into an opening by the river, and found the body of Colonel Carteret, with his spaniel Skip beside it, mourning him. Nurse Kettle was acquainted with death. She did not need Skip's lament to tell her that the curled figure resting its head on a turf of river grass was dead. She knelt beside it, and pushed her hand under the tweed jacket and silk shirt. Cooling, she thought. A tweed hat with fisherman's flies in the band lay over the face. She lifted it and remained quite still with it suspended in her hand. The colonel's temple had been broken, as if his head had come under a waxworker's hammer. The spaniel threw back his head and howled again. "He's been murdered," thought Nurse Kettle. She could see not far from the colonel's hand the glint of a trout's scale in the grass and of a knife blade nearby. His rod was laid out on the lip of the bank, less than a pace from where he lay. "I'll find the doctor," she thought. She patted Skip, made her way out of the willow grove, and presently came into the open grounds of Nunsparden. The footman answered the front door. "Is the doctor at home?" "He came in about an hour ago, miss. I want to see him, it's urgent. The family's in the library, Miss Alassa." "Don't bother," said Nurse Kettle. "Or yes, ascertain if you like, but I'll be hard on your heels." He crossed the great hall and opened the library door. Nurse Kettle, without waiting to be summoned, walked quickly into the library. The three Lacklanders had turned in their chairs. George and Mark got up. Mark looked sharply at her and came quickly towards her. Lady Lacklander said, "Kettle, what has happened to you?" Nurse Kettle said, "Good evening, Lady Lacklander. Good evening, Sir George." She put her hands behind her back and looked full at Mark. "May I speak to you, sir?" she said. "There's been an accident." "All right, nurse," Mark said. "To whom?" "To Colonel Carteret, sir." The expression of inquiry seemed to freeze on their faces. It was as if they retired behind newly assumed masks. "What sort of accident?" Mark asked. He pushed a chair forward for Nurse Kettle, and she took it thankfully. Her knees, she discovered, were wobbling. "Now then, out with it," said Lady Lacklander. "He's dead, isn't he, Kettle?" "Yes, Lady Lacklander. He's been murdered," said Nurse Kettle. In the drawing-room at Hammer there was an incongruous company assembled. Kitty Carteret, Mark Lacklander, and Nurse Kettle waited there while Lady Lacklander sat with Rose in the Colonel's study. She had arrived first at Hammer, having been driven round in her great car, while Mark and Nurse Kettle waited in the valley, and George rang up the police station at Chining. George had remembered he was a justice of the peace, and was believed to be in telephonic conference with his brethren of the bench. So it had fallen to Lady Lacklander to break the news to Kitty, whom she had found wearing her black velvet tights and flame-coloured top in the drawing-room. Presently Kitty broke into a harsh, strangulated sobbing, twisting her fingers together and turning her head aside. She walked about the room, still Lady Lacklander noticed swaying her hips. Presently she fetched up by a grog tray on a small table and shakily poured herself a drink. "That's a sensible idea," Lady Lacklander said as the neck of the decanter chattered against the glass. Kitty awkwardly offered her a drink, which she declined with perfect equanimity. "Her manner," she thought to herself,
is really too dreadful. What shall I do if George marries her?"
It was at this juncture that Nurse Kettle and Mark had appeared outside the French windows. Lady Lackland let them in. "Sergeant Oliphant's there," Mark murmured. "They're going to ring Scotland Yard. Does Rose—"
"Not yet. She's out in the garden somewhere."
Mark went across to Kitty and spoke to her with a quiet authority that his grandmother instantly approved. She noticed how Kitty steadied under it, how Mark, without fussing, got her into a chair. A light and charming voice sang in the hall.
Come away, Death."
And Mark turned sharply.
"I'll go,"
his grandmother said,
"and I'll fetch you when she asks for you."
With a swifter movement than either her size or her age would have seemed to allow, she had gone. Kitty Carteret was quieter, but still caught her breath now and again in a harsh sob.
"Can't believe it. We saw him down there fishing."
And then she suddenly demanded,
"Where's George?"
Nurse Kettle saw Mark compress his lips. At that moment George himself walked in and the party became even less happily assorted.
"My dear Kitty," said Sir George in a special voice, "I'm so terribly, terribly sorry. What can one say? What can one do?"
Kitty's distress began perceptibly to take on a more becoming guise. She looked into his eyes and said,
"How terribly good of you to come."
Mark was about to retire to the terrace when the door opened and his grandmother looked in.
"Mark,"
she said. He went quickly into the hall.
"In the study,"
Lady Lacklander said, and in a moment he was there with Rose, sobbing bitterly in his arms.
"You need pay no attention to me,"
Lady Lacklander said.
"I am about to telephone New Scotland Yard. Your father tells me they have been called in, and I propose to send for Helena Allain's boy. Central, I want New Scotland Yard, London."
Mark had drawn Rose to a chair and was kneeling beside her, gently wiping away her tears.
"Hello?"
Lady Lacklander said.
"New Scotland Yard? This is Hermione, Lady Lacklander speaking. I wish to speak to Mr. Roderick Allain."
Allain and Fox had worked late, tidying up the last phase of a tedious case of embezzlement. At 12 minutes to 10 they had finished. Allain shut the file with a slap of his hand.
"Dreary fellow," he said. "Hope they give him the maximum. Damn good riddance. Come back with me and have a drink, Brer Fox. I'm a grass widower and hating it. Troy and Ricky are in the country. What do you say?"
Fox drew his hand across the lower part of his face.
"Well now, Mr. Allain, that sounds very pleasant," he said. "I say yes, and thank you."
"Good." Allain looked round the familiar walls of the Chief Inspector's room at New Scotland Yard. "There are occasions," he said, "when one suddenly sees one's natural habitat as if for the first time. It is a terrifying sensation. Come on, let's go while the going's good." They were halfway to the door when the telephone rang. Fox said,
"Oh, hell,"
without any particular animosity, and went back to answer it.
"Chief Inspector's room," he said heavily. "Well, yes, he's here, just."
He listened for a moment, gazing blandly at his superior.
"Say I'm dead,"
Allain suggested moodily. Fox laid his great palm over the receiver.
"They make out it's a Lady Lacklander on call from somewhere called Swevenings," he said.
"Lady Lacklander? Good Lord, that's old Sir Harold Lacklander's widow." "Chief Inspector Allain will take the call," Fox said, and held out the receiver. Allain sat on his desk and announced himself into the receiver.
"Indeed,"
the voice rejoined.
"Hermione Lacklander speaking. I won't waste time reminding you about myself. You're Helena Allain's boy, and I want an assurance from you. A friend of mine has just been murdered," the voice continued, "and I hear the local police are calling in your people. I would greatly prefer you, personally, to take charge of the whole thing. That can be arranged, I imagine?"
Allain, controlling his astonishment, said, "I'm afraid only if the Assistant Commissioner happens to give me the job." A second telephone began to ring. Fox answered it, and in a moment held up a warning hand.
"Central Office, sir. Orders for Swevenings. Homicide. Blistering apes. Us?"
"Us," said Fox stolidly. Allain spoke into his own receiver. "Lady Lacklander, I am taking this case, it appears.
Glad to hear it, said Lady Lacklander. I suggest you look pretty sharp about it. Au revoir, she added with unexpected modishness, and rang off. Fox, in the meantime, had noted down instructions. "It's a Colonel Carteret," he said. "We go to a place called Chining in Barfordshire, where the local sergeant will meet us. Everything's laid on down below." Alain had already collected his hat, coat, and professional case. Fox followed his example. They went out together through the never-sleeping corridors. A car waited for them with Detective Sergeants Bailey and Thompson and their gear already on board. As they drove out of the yard, Big Ben struck 10.
"That's a remarkable woman, Fox," Alain said. "She's got a brain like a turbine and a body like a ton. Her husband was one of my great white chiefs in the Foreign Service. Solemn chap. Just missed being brilliant. Before the war, the old boy was chargé d'affaires at Zlonitsa. The special branch got involved for a time. I remember there was a very nasty bit of leakage. A decoded message followed by the suicide of the chap concerned."
For a long time they drove on in silence, broken at long intervals by the desultory conversation of old friends.
"We're running into a summer storm," Alain said presently.
Giant drops appeared on the windscreen and were followed in seconds by a blinding downpour.
Nice setup for field work," Fox grumbled.
"It may be local, although, no, by gum, we're nearly there." The air smelt fresher when they got out. Alain led the way into a typical county police station and was greeted by a tall, sandy-haired sergeant. "Chief Inspector Alain, sir. Sergeant Oliphant. Very glad to see you, sir. With that short of chaps in the country, we don't know which way to turn if anything of this nature crops up. I've left my one PC in charge of the body, and that reduces my staff to me. Shall we move off, Mr. Alain?" Alain and Fox accompanied the sergeant in his car, while Bailey and Thompson and the yard driver followed their lead. On the way, Sergeant Oliphant gave a report. "He's lying on a patch of shingles, screened in by a half-circle of willows and cut off on the open side by the stream. He's lying on his right side, kind of curled up, as if he'd been bowled over from a kneeling position, like. His hat was over his face. Nurse Kettle moved it when she found him, and Dr. Latlander moved it again when he examined the wound, which is in the left temple. A dirty great puncher, with what the doctor calls extensive fractures all around it."
"Notice anything at all out of the way?" Alain asked. Oliphant made a complicated snorting noise.
"Out of the way? Tell me now, sir, are you a fly fisherman?"
"Only fair to middling to worse. Why?"
"Now, listen," Sergeant Oliphant said, quite abandoning his official position. "There's a dirty great fish in this chine here. Pounds if he's an ounce, he is. Old and cunning he is. Wary and sullen, and that lordly in his lurkins, and slink as he'd break your heart. Sometimes he'll rise like a monster and snap. He's took it, though that's only 3 times. Once being the deceased's doing, a matter of a fortnight ago, which he left his cast in his jaws, he being a mighty fighter, and once the late Squire Sir Harold Latlander, he lost him through being, as the man himself frankly admitted, overzealous in the playing of him. Now," said the sergeant, "now for the last and final cast, hooked, played, and landed by the poor colonel, sir, and lying there by his dead body, or I can't tell a 5-pound trout from a stickleback. Well, if he had to die, he couldn't have had a more glorious end. The colonel, I mean, Mr. Alain, not the old un," said Sergeant Oliphant. They pulled up at a spot opposite the Boy and Donkey. A figure in a mackintosh and tweed hat stood in the lighted doorway. "The Chief Constable, sir," said Oliphant. "Sir James Punston. He said he'd drive over and meet you." Alain crossed the road and introduced himself. The Chief Constable was a weather-beaten, tough-looking man who had been a Chief Commissioner of Police in India.
"Thought I'd better come over," Sir James said, "and take a look at this show. Damn bad show it is."
As they slid and squelched down the muddy hillside, he gave Alain an account of the Carteret family and their neighbours. They crossed the bridge and turned left on the rough path. Alain's shoes filled with water, and water poured off the brim of his hat.
"Hell of a thing to happen, this bloody rain," said the Chief Constable. "Ruined the terrain. That's Mr. Danbury Finn's preserve above the bridge."
"Mr. Danbury Finn," Alain said sharply. "Mr. Octavius Danbury Finn, to give you the complete works. The Danbury isn't insisted upon. He's the local eccentric." Somewhere close at hand a dog howled dismally, and a deep voice apostrophized it.
"Ah, stow it, will you?"
A light bobbed up ahead of them. "Here we are," Sir James said. "That you, Gripper?"
"Yes, sir,"
said the deep voice. The mackintosh cape of a uniformed constable shone in the torchlight.
"Dog still at it, seemingly," said the sergeant.
A torch flashed on Skip, tied by a handkerchief to a willow branch. "Hello, old fellow," Alain said, pushing through the thicket. His torchlight darted about in the rain and settled almost at once on a glistening mound.
"We got some ground sheets down and covered him," the sergeant said, "when it looked like rain."
"Good. I think before we go any nearer we'll get photographs. Come through, Bailey. Do the best you can with all the detail you can get in case it washes out before morning. By Jove, though, I believe it's lifting." They all listened. The thicket was loud with the sound of dripping foliage, but the heavy drumming of rain had stopped. When Bailey had taken his last flash photograph, Alain stooped over the head and shone his torch full on the wound.
"Sharp instrument," said Fox.
"Yes," Alain said. "Yes, a great puncher, certainly. But could a sharp instrument do all that, Brer Fox?" His torchlight moved away from the face and found a silver glint on the grass. "And this is the old 'un," he murmured. The chief constable and Sergeant Oliphant both broke into excited sounds of confirmation. The light moved to the hands, lying close together. One of them was clenched about a wisp of green. "Cut grass," Alain said. "He was going to wrap his trout in it. There's his knife, and there's the creel beside him."
"What we reckon, sir," said the sergeant in agreement.
"Cover everything up again, Sergeant, and set a watch till morning. How deep," Alain asked, "is the stream just here?"
"About 5 foot," said Sergeant Oliphant.
"Really?" "And he lies on his right side, roughly parallel with the stream and facing it, not more than 2 feet from the brink, and the wound's in the left temple. I take it he was squatting on his heels within 2 feet of the brink and just about to bed his catch down in the grass. Now, if, as the heel marks near his feet seem to indicate, he keeled straight over into the position the body still holds, one of 2 things must have happened, wouldn't you say, Brer Fox?" "Either," Fox said stolidly, "he was coshed by a left-handed person standing behind him, or by a right-handed person standing in front of him, and at least 3 feet away." "Which would place the assailant," said Alain, "about 12 inches out on the surface of the stream." The chief constable said, "I gather there's a crowd of possible witnesses waiting for you at Hammer. That's Carteret's house up here on Watts Hill. If you'll forgive me, Alain, I won't go up with you. Serve no useful purpose. By the way, I've told them at the Boy and Donkey that you'll probably want beds for what's left of the night. Good night." He was gone before Alain could thank him. With the sergeant as guide, Alain and Fox prepared to set out for Hammer. Alain had succeeded in persuading the spaniel Skip to accept them, and after 1 or 2 false starts and whimperings, he followed at their heels. Oliphant, who was in the lead, suddenly uttered a violent oath.
"God!" Oliphant said. "I thought someone was looking at me. God, do you see that?"
His wavering torchlight flickered on wet willow leaves. A pair of luminous discs stared out at them from the level of a short man's eyes. "Touches of surrealism," Alain muttered, "in Bottom Meadow." He advanced his own torch, and they saw a pair of spectacles caught up in a broken twig. "We'll pluck this fruit with grateful care," he said, and gathered the spectacles into his handkerchief. The moon now shone, turning the bridge and the inky shadow it cast over the broken-down boat-shed and punt into a subject for a wood engraving. They climbed the river path up Watts Hill. Skip began to whine and to wag his tail. In a moment the cause of his excitement came into view. A large tabby cat, sitting on the path in the bright moonlight, washing her whiskers. Thomasina Twitchit, for it was she, rolled on her back at Alain's feet and trilled beguilement. Alain stooped down and picked her up. She kneaded his chest and advanced her nose towards his. "My God, woman," Alain said, "you've been eating fish." Though he was unaware of it at the time, this was an immensely significant discovery. They emerged in full view of Hammer Farmhouse, with its row of French windows lit behind their curtains. Skip gave a bark and darted ahead. One of the curtains was pulled open, and Mark Lacklander came through to the terrace, followed by Rose. "Miss Carteret," Alain said. "We are from the CID. My name is Alain."
"Will you come in?"
Rose said. She led the way into the drawing-room, where Alain found an out-of-drawing conversation piece established. Lady Lacklander, a vast black bulk, completely filled an armchair. Kitty Carteret was extended on a sofa with one black velvet leg dangling, a cigarette in her holder, and a glass in her hand. Between the two oddly assorted women, poised on the hearthrug with a whisky and soda, looking exquisitely uncomfortable and good-looking, was Sir George Lacklander. And at a remove, in a small chair, perfectly at her ease, sat Nurse Kettle.
"Hello," said Lady Lacklander. "You're Roderick Alleyne, aren't you? We haven't met since you left the Foreign Service, and that's not yesterday nor the day before that. How's your mamma?"
"Very well, considering," Alleyne said, taking a hand like a pincushion in his.
"Considering what? Her age? She's 5 years my junior, and there's nothing but fat amiss with me. Kitty, this is Roderick Alleyne, Mrs. Carteret, my son George."
"Aye," George intervened coldly.
"And over there is Miss Kettle, our district nurse." "Good evening,"
Lady Lacklander continued, looking at Fox.
"Good evening, my lady,"
said Fox placidly. "Inspector Fox," Alleyne said.
"Now, what do you propose to do with us all? Take your time," she added kindly.
Alleyne turned to Kitty Carteret. "I'm sorry," he said, "to come so hard on the heels of what must have been an appalling shock. I'm afraid that in these cases police inquiries are not the easiest ordeals to put up with. If I may, Mrs. Carteret, I'll begin by asking, do we know of anybody who was near Colonel Carteret within, let us say, 2 hours of the time, I believe it was 5 minutes to 9, when you, Miss Kettle, found him?"
"I was,"
said Lady Lacklander.
"I made an appointment with him for 8, which he kept 20 minutes early. Our meeting took place on the riverbank opposite the Willow Grove, where I understand he was found."
"That's a starting point, at least. Does anyone know anything about Colonel Carteret's movements after this meeting, which lasted, how long do you think, Lady Lacklander?"
"About 10 minutes. I packed up my things and left them to be collected and went home. I'd been sketching."
Kitty said,
"I didn't see him, but I must have been somewhere near him, I suppose, when I came back from the golf course. I got home at 8:05, I remember."
"The golf course?"
"At Nun's Pardon,"
George Lacklander said.
"Mrs. Carteret and I played a round of golf there this evening."
"I see. You came home by the bottom bridge, Mrs. Carteret?"
"Yes, the river path."
"On the far side, wouldn't you overlook the Willow Grove?"
"Yes, I suppose you would. As a matter of fact, I was looking, actually, at the upper reaches to see—"
She glanced at George Lacklander.
"Well, to see if I could spot Mr. Finn," she said.
In the silence that followed, all 3 Lacklanders made slight movements that were instantly checked. "Mr. Danbury Finn," Alleyne said.
"Yes."
"Poaching!"
George Lacklander ejaculated.
"We saw him from the second tee. He was on his own ground on the right bank above the bridge, casting above the bridge and letting the stream carry his cast under the bridge and into Carteret's waters. Most blackguardly thing I ever saw."
"Of course," Alleyne said. "You were sketching, Lady Lacklander, weren't you? Whereabouts?"
"In a hollow about the length of this room, below the bridge, on the left bank."
"Near a clump of alders?"
"You're a sharpish, observant fellow, it appears. Exactly there. I couldn't see Mr. Finn poaching, but somebody else could and did. None other," said Lady Lacklander, "than poor Maurice Carteret himself. He saw it, and the devil of a row they had over it, I may tell you. Maurice caught Ockie red-handed, having just landed the Olden. They didn't see me," Lady Lacklander went on, "because I was down in my hollow on the other bank. Ockie bawled out that Maurice could have his so-and-so fish, and Maurice said he wouldn't be seen dead with it."
A look of absolute horror appeared for 1 second in Lady Lacklander's eyes. She hurried on.
"There was a thump, as if someone had thrown something wet and heavy on the ground, and on that note they parted. Maurice came fuming over the hillock and saw me. Ockie, as far as I know, stormed back up the hill to Jacob's cottage."
"Had Colonel Carteret got the fish in his hands then?"
"Not he. He left it there on the bridge. I saw it when I went home. For all I know, it's still lying there on the bridge."
"It's lying by Colonel Carteret," Alleyne said. "And the question seems to be, doesn't it, who put it there?" This time the silence was long and completely blank. Alleyne addressed Lady Lacklander. "I think you said you left your painting gear to be collected, didn't you?"
"I did."
"Who collected it, please?"
"One of the servants. William the footman, probably."
"No," Mark said. "No, Gar, I did."
"You?"
his grandmother said,
"What were you doing?"
and stopped short. Mark said rapidly that after making a professional call in the village, he had gone in to play tennis at Hammer and had stayed there until about 10 minutes past 8. He had returned home by the river path and as he approached Bottom Bridge had seen his grandmother's shooting stick, stool and painting gear in a deserted group on a hillock. He carried them back to Nun's Pardon. Alain asked him if he had noticed a large trout lying on Bottom Bridge. Mark said that he hadn't done so. "Mrs. Carteret," Alain said, "you must have crossed Bottom Bridge a few minutes after Lady Lacklander had gone home, mustn't you? Did you see the fabulous trout lying on Bottom Bridge?" "Not a sign of it, I'm afraid." "So that between about 10 to 8 and 10 past 8 the trout was removed by somebody and subsequently left in the willow grove." It was at this moment that Kitty Carteret screamed. She was staring at something beyond and behind Alain. They all turned, but found only an uncovered French window.
"There's someone out there,"
Kitty whispered. "It's probably Sergeant Oliphant," Alain said. "We left him outside, Fox." Fox was already on his way when the figure of a man appeared moving uncertainly. Fox opened the French window.
"Pray forgive an unwarrantable intrusion,"
said Mr. Danbury Finn.
"I am in quest of a fish."
Mr. Finn squinted at Fox and then beyond him at the company in the drawing-room.
"I fear I've called at an inconvenient moment," he said. "I had hoped to see Colonel Carteret."
"Did you say, sir," Alain asked, "that you were looking for a fish?" Mr. Finn said,
"Forgive me, I don't think I have the pleasure."
"We are police officers," Alain said. "Colonel Carteret has been murdered. You are Mr. Octavius Danbury Finn, I think, aren't you?"
"But how perfectly terrible,"
said Mr. Finn.
"My dear Mrs. Carteret, my dear Miss Rose, I am appalled, appalled."
Alain said, "I should like you to tell me about the fish you were looking for."
"The fish? The fish, my dear sir, is or was a magnificent trout, a piscine emperor, and I, let me tell you, I caught him."
"What," Alain asked, "happened to your catch?" Mr. Finn began to speak very quickly indeed.
"Flushed with triumph, I resolved to try the upper reaches of the Chine. I therefore laid my captive to rest on the upper approach to Bottom Bridge. When I returned much later, I cannot tell you how much later, for I did not carry a watch, but much, much later, I went to the exact spot where my Prince of Piscines should have rested, and—"
He made a wide gesture.
"Gone! Vanished! I returned home a bitterly chagrined man."
"And there you remained, it seems, for about 4 hours. It's now 1:05 in the morning. Why at such an hour are you paying this visit, Mr. Finn?"
"Why?"
Mr. Finn exclaimed, spreading his unsteady hands.
"My dear sir, rendered almost suicidal by the loss of this Homeric catch, I was unable to contemplate my couch with any prospect of repose. I attempted to read, to listen to the wireless. I sought the relief of fresh air and took a turn down the river path, from whence I observed lights behind these windows."
"Mr. Finn," Alain said, "you normally wear spectacles, I think, don't you?"
"Only for reading,"
he said. Lady Lacklander suddenly clapped her hands.
"So there we are," she said. "George, I should like you to take me home."
She looked straight into Alain's eyes.
"Do you propose to let me go home?"
Alain raised an eyebrow. "I shall feel a good deal safer," he said, "with you there than here, Lady Lacklander."
"Take me to my car."
Alain hastened to open the door and followed her to the main entrance. Outside this, a vast elderly car waited.
"Now tell me,"
she said after she had heaved herself in.
"Tell me, not as a policeman to an octogenarian dowager, but as a man of discretion to one of your mother's oldest friends, what do you think of Ocky Finn's behaviour just now?"
Alain said, "Octogenarian dowagers, even if they are my mother's oldest friends, shouldn't lure me out of doors at night and make improper suggestions."
"Ah," she said, "so you're not going to respond."
"Tell me, did Mr. Finn have a son called Ludovic? Ludovic Danbury Finn?" He watched her face harden.
"I wouldn't mention the boy if I were you. He was in the Foreign Service, and blotted his copybook, as I dare say you know."
"Do you mind telling me what you and Colonel Carteret talked about?"
"We talked about Ocky poaching, and about a domestic matter that is for the moment private, and can have no bearing whatever on Morris's death."
Can you remember exactly what Mr. Finn and Colonel Carteret said to each other when they had their row? She looked hard at him.
Not word for word. They had a row over the fish.
Did they talk about anything else? Lady Lacklander said.
No.
Very coolly indeed.
Ocky Finn is no murderer.
Is he not? Alain said. Well, that's something to know, isn't it? Good night. He shut the door. The light in the car went out. As he turned back to the house, Alain met George Lacklander. It struck him that George was remarkably ill at ease in his company. Simply for the record, I shall have to put this sort of question to everybody who was in Colonel Carteret's landscape last evening. You and Mrs. Carteret began your round of golf, I think you said at 7. I didn't notice the exact time, George said in a hurry. Mrs. Carteret says she arrived here at about 8:05. Perhaps you played golf roughly for an hour. How many holes? We didn't go round the course. Mrs. Carteret is learning. We spent the time practicing some of her shots, George said haughtily. Ah, yes, and you parted company at about 8:10. Where? At the top of the river path, and now if you'll excuse me, I really must drive my mamma home. Yes, I think we may let you go now. Afraid I shall have to ask you to stay in Swevenings for the time being. Damn nuisance, I know, but there you are, if they will turn on homicide in your bottom meadow. Good night to you. He circumnavigated George and returned to the drawing-room where he addressed himself to Kitty Carteret. If I may, he said, I should like to have a very short talk with Miss Kettle. Is there perhaps another room we may use, a study perhaps? Mrs. Carteret hesitated, but Rose said, Yes, of course, I'll show you. Fox had gone to the French window and had made a majestical signal to the sergeant, who now came into the drawing-room. You all know Sergeant Oliphant, of course, Alain said. He will be in charge of the local arrangements. Mr. Finn, I will ask you to repeat the substance of your account to Sergeant Oliphant, who will take it down and get you to sign it if it is correct. Mr. Finn blinked at him. And now, Miss Carteret, may we indeed use the study? Rose led the way across the hall into the room where 8 hours ago she had talked to her father about her love for Mark. Alain and Fox followed.
He seems to be here, you know. This was his place more than anywhere else.
She faltered. Alain asked quietly, Was he worried about anything?
Yes, he was indeed. But it's private, and even if it wasn't, it couldn't possibly be of any use.
When did you see him last?
This evening. I mean, last evening, don't I? He went out soon after 7.
Where did he go? She hesitated and then said,
I believe to call on Mr. Finn.
Do you know why?
I think it had something to do with the publishing business.
The publishing business? She pushed a strand of hair back and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes.
I don't know who could do such a thing to him, she said.
Her voice was drained of all its colour. Her eyes, fatigued by tears, looked for a moment at a table where a tray of casts were set out.
I always tied the flies. We made up a fly he nearly always fished with. I tied one this afternoon.
The door opened and Mark Lacklander came in looking angry. Ah, there you are, he said. He walked straight over and put his fingers on her wrists. You're going to bed at once. I've asked Nurse Kettle to make a hot drink for you. She's waiting for you now. He glared at Alain. Miss Carteret is my patient, he said, and those are my instructions. They sound altogether admirable, Alain rejoined. I wonder if we may see Nurse Kettle as soon as she is free, and you a little later, if you please, Dr. Lacklander. Certainly, sir, Mark said stiffly, and taking Rose's arm, led her out of the room. Nurse Kettle sat tidily on an armless chair. She had just given Alain a neat account of her finding of Colonel Carteret's body. That's all, really, she said, except that I had a jolly strong feeling I was being watched. You get it on night duty in a ward, a patient lying awake and staring at you. You always know before you look. I suppose, Alain said, you know all these people pretty well, don't you, Miss Kettle? I always think in country districts the Queen's nurses are rather like liaison officers. Nurse Kettle looked pleased. Well now, she said, we do get to know people. Of course our duties take us mostly to the ordinary folk, although with the present shortage we find ourselves doing quite a lot for the other sort. They pay the full fee and that helps the association. So, as long as it's not depriving the ones who can't afford it, we take the odd upper-class case, like me and Lady Lacklander's toe, for instance.
And then again I night-nursed the old gentleman. With him when he died, actually. Well, so was the family, and the Colonel too, as it happens.
Colonel Carteret?
That's right. Or, wait a moment, I'm telling stories. The Colonel didn't come back into the room. He stayed on the landing with the papers.
The papers?
The old gentleman's memoirs, they were. The Colonel was to see about publishing them. The old gentleman was very troubled about them. He couldn't be content to say goodbye and give up until he'd seen the Colonel. Well, no sooner had he handed them over than he took much worse, and the Colonel gave the alarm. We all went in. I gave brandy. Dr. Mark gave an injection, but it was all over in a minute. Vic, he said. Vic. That was all.
Alain repeated. Vic. And they were silent for so long that Nurse Kettle had begun to say,
Well, if that's all I can do,
when he interrupted her. I was going to ask you, he said, who lives in the house between this one and Mr. Finn's? Nurse Kettle smiled.
At Uplands, she said. Commander Seiss. He's another of my victims, she added, and unaccountably turned rather pink. Down with a bad go of Bago, poor chap.
Miss Kettle, you liked Colonel Carteret, didn't you? It was clear from your manner, I thought, that you liked him very much indeed.
Well, I did. He was one of the nicest and gentlest souls. Devoted father, never said an unkind word about anybody.
Not even about Mr. Finn?
Now look here, she said. Mr. Finn's eccentric, but there's no harm in him. He's had this tragedy in his life, poor man, and in my opinion he's never been the same since it happened. Before the war it was. His only son did away with himself. Shocking thing.
Wasn't the son in the Foreign Service?
That's right. Ludovic. He was in some foreign place when it happened. Broke his mother's heart, they always say, but she was a cardiac anyway, poor thing. Mr. Finn never really got over it.
I remember hearing about it, said Alain, vaguely. Wasn't he one of Sir Harold Lacklander's young men?
That's right.
So the Swevelings families tend to gravitate towards foreign parts. Nurse Kettle said they certainly seemed to do so. Apart from the young Vicky Danbury Finn getting a job in Sir Harold's embassy, there was Commander Seiss, whose ship had been based at Singapore, and the Colonel himself, who had been attached to a number of missions in the Far East, including one at Singapore. Nurse Kettle added that she believed he had met his second wife there.
Really?
Alain said, with no display of interest. At the time when Seiss was out there, do you mean? It was the merest shot in the dark, but it found its mark. Nurse Kettle became pink and said with excessive brightness that she believed that the Commander and the second Mrs. C had known each other out in the East. She added, with an air of cramming herself over some emotional hurdle, that she had seen a very pretty drawing that the Commander had made of Mrs. Carteret.
You'd pick it out for her at once, she said.
Did you know the first Mrs. Carteret?
Well, not to say no. They were only married 18 months when she died giving birth to Miss Rose.
She stood up.
If there's nothing more, she said, I'll just have a word with the doctor and see if there's anything I can do for Miss Rose or her stepmother before they settle down.
Alain and Fox contemplated each other with the absent-minded habit of long association. Before we see Dr. Lacklander, Alain said, let's take stock, Brer Fox. What are you thinking about? Fox dragged his palm across his jaw.
For a secluded district, he said, there seems to have been quite a bit of traffic in the Valley of the Chine.
Doesn't there? Down this hill, over the bridge, up the other hill, and t'other way round, none of them meeting except the murdered man and old Finn at 7:30, and the murdered man and Lady Lacklander 10 minutes later. Otherwise it seems to have been a series of near misses on all hands. Let's have a word with young Lacklander, shall we? Fetch him in, Foxkin, and while you're there, see how Mr. Finn's getting on with his statement to the sergeant. While Fox was away, Alain looked more closely at Colonel Carteret's study. He was interested to find a sizable book with the title The Scaly Breed by Maurice Carteret. It was a work on the habits and characteristics of freshwater trout. Alain's gaze travelled over the surface of the desk and ran down the front. He tried the drawers. The top pair were unlocked and contained only writing paper and envelopes. The centre pairs on each side were locked. The bottom left-hand drawer pulled out. It was empty. His attention sharpened. He had stooped down to look more closely at it when he heard Fox's voice in the hall. He pushed the drawer to and stood away from the desk. Mark Lacklander came in with Fox. Alain said, I shan't keep you for long. Indeed, I have only asked you to come in to clear up one small point and to help us with another. The first question is this. When you went home at 8:15 last evening, did you hear a dog howling in Bottom Meadow? No, Mark said. No, I'm sure I didn't, but I remembered meeting a tabby cat, one of Ocky Finn's menagerie, I imagine, on an evening stroll. Where was she? This side of the bridge, said Mark, looking bored. Right. I believe, Alain said, that Sir Harold's autobiography is to be published. Mark said, Did Finn tell you that? Now, why in the wide world, Alain asked, should Mr. Octavius Finn tell me? There was a long silence, broken by Mark. I'm sorry, sir, Mark said. I must decline absolutely to answer any more questions. You're perfectly within your rights. Is there any objection now to my driving to the dispensary? No objection in the world, he said. Good morning to you, Dr. Lacklander. Mark repeated, I'm sorry. And with a troubled look at both of them went out of the room. Brer Fox, Alain said, we shall snatch a couple of hours of sleep at the Boy and Donkey, but before we do so, will you bend your fancy upon the bottom drawer on the left-hand side of Colonel Carteret's desk? Fox did as he was bidden. Forced, he said. Recent, chipped. Quite so. Job's been done unhandily by an amateur. We'll seal this room, and tomorrow we'll put in the camera and Dabs boys. In the morning, Foxkin, if you're a good boy, you shall be told the sad and cautionary story of Master Ludovic Finn. Fox was duly acquainted with the story of Ludovic Finn over ham and eggs in the parlour of the Boy and Donkey shortly after dawn. I know about young Finn, Alain said, because his debacle occurred when I was doing a spell in the Special Branch in 1937. At that time, the late Sir Harold Lacklander was our ambassador at Zlonitzer, and Master Danbury Finn was his personal secretary. Young Finn arrived with his alma mater's milk wet on his lips. He made some very dubious Zlonitzer chums, among whom was a German agent of a particularly persuasive sort. He became completely sold on the Nazi formula, and on the night after a crucial cable had come through for his chief, he presented his Zlonitzer chums with the whole story. Lacklander gave him bottled hell, and he went away and blew his brains out. A brilliant but unbalanced boy. His mother died a few months afterwards, I believe. Sad, said Mr. Fox. Would you say, Mr. Alain, now, that this Mr. Finn Senior was slightly round the bend? His behaviour in the watches of last night was certainly oddish. He was a frightened man, Fox, if ever I saw one. What do you think? The opportunity was there, Fox said, going straight to the first principle of police investigation. It was. And by the way, Bailey's done his dab drill. The spectacles are Mr. Danbury Finn's. It's not conclusive. He might have lost them down there earlier in the day, but there's one item that emerged last night which I don't think we can afford to disregard, Fox. I take it, Fox said, that you're wondering if there's a full account of young Finn's offence in the memoirs. They link the Carterets with the Lacklanders, and they may well link Mr. Finn with both. They provide so far the only connecting theme in this group of apparently very conventional people. There's a car pulling up. It'll be Dr. Curtis. Let's return to the bottom field and to the question of opportunity and evidence. By midsummer morning light, Colonel Carteret looked incongruous in the willow grove. Dr. Curtis completed a superficial examination and stood up. That's all I want here, Alain, he said. I've given Oliphant the contents of the pockets. As for general appearances, Rigor is well established, and is, I think, about to go off. I understand you found out that he was alive up to 8:15, and that he was found dead at 9. Well, I won't get any closer in time than that. The injuries? Tentatively, 2 weapons. There's a clean puncture with deep penetration. There's circular indentation with the puncture at its centre, and there's been a heavy blow over the same area. And no prints, Alain said. There's prints from the people that found him, clear enough, and there's his own heel marks. You can see how he was, clear enough. Yes, Alain said, squatting on a bit of soft ground facing the stream. He'd cut several handfuls of grass with his knife and was about to wrap up that trout. He turned towards the stream. Look here, Fox. He nodded at a group of tall daisies and pointed to 3 leggy stems taller than their fellows, from which the blooms had been cut away. You can move him, he said, but don't tramp over the ground more than you can help. And by the way, Fox, have you noticed that inside the willow grove, near the point of entry, there's a flattened patch of grass and several broken and bent twigs? Remember that Nurse Kettle thought she was observed? Go ahead, Oliphant. Sergeant Oliphant and P.C. Gripper came forward with a stretcher. They put it down some distance from the body which they now raised. As they did so, a daisy head dropped from the coat. Pick it up tenderly, Alain said as he did so, and treat it with care. We must find the other two if we can. This murderer said it with flowers. Alain found a second daisy on the bank below the point where Colonel Carteret's head had lain. The third, he said, may have gone downstream, but we'll see. He now looked at Colonel Carteret's rod. Alain lifted the cast and sniffed at it. He hooked a fish yesterday, he said. There's a flake of flesh on the barb. Where, then, is this trout he caught? Damn this ruined ground. He cautiously lifted the Olden and examined the patch of stones where the great fish had lain. Look, there's a sharp, flinty bit of stone with a flap of fish skin on it. Now, let's see. He turned the great trout over and searched its clamminess for a sign of a missing piece of skin and could find none. Well, it's pretty clear that he made a catch of his own and that the fish itself was subsequently removed and the Olden put in its place. Now, take a look upstream towards the bridge, Brer Fox. Go round about, because we'll still keep the immediate vicinity unmucked up. And then come out here. Fox joined Alain on the lower bank of the little bay at the point where it jutted farthest out into the stream. They looked up the chine past the willow grove, which hid the near end of the bridge to the far end, which was just visible about 40 feet away, with the old punt moored in the hole beneath it. Alain said, "Charming, isn't it? Like a lead-pencil vignette in a Victorian album. Stay where you are, Fox, for a moment, will you? Get down on your sinful old hunkers and bow your head over an imaginary fish. Don't look up, and don't move till I tell you." "Ah, what's all this, I do wonder?" Mr. Fox speculated and squatted calmly at the water's edge with his great hands between his feet. Alain skirted round the crucial area and disappeared into the willow grove. It was quite a shock to Dr. Curtis, Bailey, Thompson, Oliphant, and Gripper when round the upstream point of the Willow Grove Bay the old punt came sliding with Alain standing in it, a wilted daisy head in his hand. The punt was carried transversely by the current away from the far bank and across the main stream into the little Willow Grove harbour. It glided silently to rest, its square prow fitting neatly into the scar in the downstream bank. At the same time its bottom grated on the gravel spit, and it became motionless. "I suppose," Alain said, "you heard that, didn't you?" Fox looked up. "I heard it," he said, "but I saw and heard nothing until then." "Carteret must have heard it too," Alain said, "which accounts, I fancy, for the daisies. Brer Fox, do you think we know who done it?" Fox said, "If I take your meaning, Mr. Alain, I think you do." "Things to be borne in mind," Alain said, still speaking from the punt. "Point 1. I found the daisy head in the prow. Point 2. This old crock has got a spare mooring line about 30 feet long. It's still made fast at the other end, and I've only got to haul myself back. I imagine the arrangement is for the convenience of Lady Lacklander, who, judging by splashes of old watercolour, occasionally paints from the punt. There is also, by the way, a pale yellow giant hairpin in close association with 2 or 3 cigarette butts, some with lipstick and some not. Been there for some considerable time, I should say, so that's another story." "Sir G," Fox ruminated, "and the girlfriend?" "Trust you," Alain said, "for clamping down on the sex story. To return, point 3, remember that the punt journey would be hidden from the dwellers on Watts Hill. Only this end of the bridge and the small area between it and the willow grove is visible to them. I suggest that the killer saw Carteret from the other bank, squatting over his catch. I suggest the killer, familiar with the punt, slipped into it, let go the painter, and was carried across the stream and into this bay. I suggest that this person was well enough acquainted with the Colonel for him merely to look up when he heard the punt grate on the gravel and not rise. Have a look at the area between the punt and the place where the body lay. It would be possible to step from the punt onto that patch of stones, and you would then be standing close to the position of Colonel Carteret's head. You would leave little or no trace of your presence, and there are several pieces of cut grass in the bottom of the punt, and they smell of fish." "Do they now?" said Fox appreciatively. "I'm leaving orders, Oliphant, for a No. 1 search for the missing fish, and meet me," Alain said to Fox, "on the other bank. I've something to show you." He gathered up the long tow rope, pulled himself easily into the contra-current, and so back across the stretch of water to the boat shed. When Fox, having come round by the bridge, joined him there, he was shaking his head. "Oliphant and his boys have been over the ground like a herd of rhinos," he said, still. "Have a look here, Fox." They stood looking down at a scarcely perceptible hole in the turf. The grass nearby showed traces of pressure. "If you examine that hole closely," Alain said, "you'll see it's surrounded by a circular indentation."
"Yes," Fox said after a long pause. "Yes, by God, so it is. Same as the injury, by God."
"It's the mark of the second weapon," Alain said. "It's the mark of a shooting stick, Brer Fox." "Attractive house," Alain said as they emerged from the home coppice into full view of Nun's Pardon. "We'll have to go cautiously here, Brer Fox, by gum we shall," he added as Lady Lacklander came out of the house with half a dozen dogs at her heels.
"She's wearing men's boots," Fox observed.
"That may be because of her ulcerated toe."
"Ah, to be sure. Lord love her, she's got a shooting stick on her arm."
"So she has."
"Hell's boots, she's going to sit on it."
Lady Lacklander had halted, opened her shooting stick, and, with alarming empiricism, let herself down on it.
"With her weight," Alain said crossly, "she'll bloody well bury it. Come on."
As soon as they were within hailing distance, Lady Lacklander shouted,
"Good morning to you. Have you been up all night? Not that you look like it, I may say."
Alain said, "We're sorry to begin plaguing you so early, but we're in a bit of a jam. I want to reconstruct the crucial bit of the landscape as it was after you left it. Will you lend us your shooting stick and your sketching gear for an hour or so? We'll take the greatest care of them."
"Well, I don't know what you're up to," she said, "and I suppose I may as well make up my mind that I won't find out. Here you are."
She heaved herself up and with a single powerful wrench tore the shooting stick from its bondage.
"The sketching gear is up at the house. Come and get it?"
Alain thanked her, and they all three went up to the house. George Lacklander was in the hall.
"Well, George," his mother said, and bestowed a peculiar smirk upon him, "I don't suppose they'll let me out on bail, but no doubt you'll be allowed to visit me."
"Really, Mamma?"
"Roderick is demanding my sketching gear on what appears to me to be a sadly trumped-up excuse. He has not yet, however, administered what I understand to be the usual warning."
"Really, Mamma?"
George repeated with a miserable titter.
"Come along, Rory,"
Lady Lacklander continued, and led Alain into a cloakroom where umbrellas, an assortment of galoshes, boots and shoes, and a variety of rackets and clubs were assembled.
"Help yourself."
"Thanks so much for helping us," Alain said. He and Fox were aware of her great bulk motionless on the steps as they made their way back to the home coppice. "And I don't mind betting," Alain said, "that from the rear we look as self-conscious as a brace of snowballs in hell." When they were out of sight in the trees, they examined their booty. Alain laid the shooting stick on a bank and squatted beside it. "The disc," he said, "screws on above the ferrule, which obviously hasn't been disengaged for weeks, all to the good. If it's the weapon, there's a good chance of a blood trace under the collar. Must let Curtis have this at once. Now let's have a look at her kit." He unbuckled the straps and peered inside, sniffing. He drew a length of stained cotton rag out of the kit. It was blotched with patches of watery colour, and with one dark brownish-reddish stain. Alain looked up at his colleague. "Smell, Fox," he said. Fox sniffed stertorously. "Fish," he said. After they handed over Lady Lacklander's property to Sergeant Oliphant with an explanatory note for Dr. Curtis and instructions to search the valley for the missing trout, they then climbed the river path to Uplands. They passed through the Hammer Farm spinney and entered that of Commander Seiss. Here they encountered a small notice nailed to a tree. "Beware of archery." "Look at that," Fox said, "and we've forgotten our green tights." As they emerged from Commander Seiss's spinney into his garden, they heard a twang followed by a peculiar whining sound and the took of a penetrating blow. "What the hell's that?" Fox exclaimed. "Sounded like the flight of an arrow." "Which is not surprising," Alain rejoined, "as that is what it was." He nodded at a tree not far from where they stood, and there was embedded an arrow prettily flighted in red. Alain pulled out the arrow and looked closely at it. Deadly if they hit the right spot. Come on. They emerged from the spinney to discover Commander Seiss himself some 50 yards away, bow in hand. As they plodded up the hill, he looked anywhere but at them, and when finally Alain introduced himself and Fox, he shied away from them like an unbroken colt. "We are," Alain explained, "police officers." "Good Lord! I suppose you've heard of last night's tragedy." "What tragedy?" "Colonel Carteret has been murdered."
"Great grief! When?"
"About 9 o'clock, we think."
"Who found him?"
"The district nurse, Nurse Kettle." Commander Seiss turned scarlet.
"I say, come in, won't you? No good nattering out here, what?"
They followed him into his desolate drawing room and noted the improvised bed now tidily made up and a table set out with an orderly array of drawing materials and watercolours. Alain said that as a matter of routine the police were calling upon Carteret's neighbours. "We hoped that by talking to those of the Colonel's neighbours who were anywhere near—"
"I wasn't nowhere near."
"Then you know where he was found?"
"Of course I do. You said 9 o'clock. The lady who told me found her left here at 5 to 9. I saw her go down into the valley. She found him at 9. He must have been in the perishing valley, mustn't he? I watched her go down."
"From where?"
"From the window."
"You on your feet, then? Not completely prostrate with lumbago?" Commander Seiss began to look wretchedly uncomfortable.
I struggled up, don't you know," he said.
"And this morning you've quite recovered?"
"Comes and goes."
"Very tricky," said Alain. "I understand that you've known Colonel Carteret a great many years."
"Off and on, neighbours, damn nice fella."
"Exactly, and I believe that when Carteret was in the Far East you ran up against him at Hong Kong, was it?"
"Singapore."
"Oh, yes. The reason why I'm asking you is we are wondering if it can possibly be a backkick from his work out in the East."
"Wouldn't know."
"Did you see much of them out there?"
"Them?"
"The Carterets." Commander Seiss glared at Alain.
"He wasn't married," he said. "Then."
"So you didn't meet the second Mrs. Carteret until you came back here, I suppose?" Commander Seiss thrust his hands into his pockets and walked over to the window.
"I had met her, yes," he mumbled, "out there."
"Before they married?"
"Yes."
"Did you bring them together?" Alain asked lightly, and he saw the muscles in the back of Seiss's neck stiffen under the reddened skin.
"I introduced them as it happens,"
Seiss said loudly without turning his head. "That's always rather amusing."
"Oh, I find it so, being,"
Alain said, looking fixedly at Fox, "an incorrigible matchmaker."
"Good God, nothing like that!"
Seiss shouted.
"Last thing I intended, good God, no!"
He spoke with extraordinary vehemence, and seemed to be moved equally by astonishment, shame, and indignation. Alain noticed the unsteady hands, moist skin and patchy colour, and the bewildered, unhappy look in the very blue eyes. "Alcoholic, poor devil," he thought. "So you bring about this first meeting with I don't know Mrs. Carteret's maiden name," Commander Seiss mumbled unhappily.
"De Vere."
There was a marked silence. Fox cleared his throat. "Ah, yes," Alain said.
"Would you have thought,"
Fox asked as he and Alain made their way through Mr. Finn's coppice to Jacob's cottage,
"that the present Mrs. Carteret was born into the purple, Mr. Alain?"
"I wouldn't have said so, Brer Fox. I should think she must find life in Sweatherings pretty dim. Here's Mr. Finn Spinney, and here, I think, is our girlfriend of last night." Mrs. Thomasina Twitchett was, in fact, taking a stroll. "Good morning, my dear," said Alain. They climbed up through Mr. Finn's spinney and finally emerged on the lawn before Jacob's cottage.
"Though if that's a cottage," Fox observed, "Buck House is a bungalow."
Mr. Finn came out of his house accompanied by an escort of cats and Mrs. Twitchett's 3 fat kittens.
"No more,"
he was saying in his curious alto voice.
"All gone. Go and catch mice, you lazy lot of fires."
He set down the empty dish he had been carrying. Some object fell from his breast pocket and he replaced it in a hurry. Then he saw Alain and Fox.
"Good morning,"
Mr. Finn fluted thickly.
"To what beneficent constabular breeze do I owe this enchanting surprise?"
"Detectives armed, I perceive," he added, with a malevolent glance at Commander Seiss's arrow, which Alain had retained by the simple expedient of absent-mindedly walking away with it. "Good morning, Mr. Finn," Alain said. "I have been renewing my acquaintance with your charming cat." He sat on his heels beside Mrs. Twitchett, who gently kicked away one of her 2 greedy kittens. "Her fur's in wonderful condition for a nursing mother," he said, stroking it. "Do you give her anything special to eat?" Mr. Finn began to talk with the sickening extravagance of the feline fanatic.
"A balanced diet," he explained, "of her own choosing. Fissy on Mondays and Fridays, steaky on Tuesdays, livy on Wednesdays, cooked bun on Thursdays and Sundays."
"Fish only twice a week," Alain mused. "You don't occasionally catch her dinner for her in the chine?" When I am successful, Mr. Finn said, we share. Did you? Alain asked, fatuously addressing himself to the cat. Did you have fresh fissy for your supper last night, my angel? No, said Mr. Finn. You made no other catch, then, besides the fabulous Olden? No. May we talk? Mr. Finn, silent for once, led the way through a side door and down a passage into a sizable library. The Colonel's study had been pleasant, civilized, and not lacking in feminine graces. Mr. Finn's library was disorderly, dirty, and neglected. It was on Mr. Finn's shelves that Alain noticed an unexpected link with the Colonel, for here among a collection of books on angling he saw again The Scaly Breed by Maurice Carteret. But what interested Alain perhaps more than all these items was a state of chaos that was to be observed on and near a very nice serpentine-fronted bureau. "Glass of sherry?" asked Mr. Finn. "No, I'm afraid this is a duty call." "Indeed? How I wish I could be of some help. I have spent a perfectly wretched night fretting and speculating, you know. A murderer in the Vale. We are so very respectable in Sweatherings, not a ripple, one would have thought, on the surface of the chine." "Would one not?" Alain asked. "What about the Battle of the Olden?" Mr. Finn fluttered his fingers. "Nil-nissy," he said with rather breathless airiness, "and all the rest of it. But really, the Colonel was most exasperating as an angler. A monument of integrity in every other respect, I dare say, but as a fly fisherman I am sorry to say there were some hideous lapses. It is an ethical paradox that so noble a sport should occasionally be wedded to such lamentable malpractices." "Such," Alain suggested, "as casting under a bridge into your neighbour's preserves?" "I will defend my action before the judgment seat, and the ghost of the sublime Walton himself will thunder in my defence. It was entirely permissible." "Did you and the Colonel," Alain said, "speak of anything else but this ethical paradox?" Mr. Finn glared at him, opened his mouth, and shut it again. "You, of course, have your information from Lady Gargantua, the mammoth chatelaine, the great lady of Nun's Pardon," said Mr. Finn, and then surprisingly turned pink. His gaze, oddly fixed, was directed past Alain's elbow to some object behind him. "Did she divulge the nature of my farther conversation with the Colonel?" "No." "Then neither," said Mr. Finn, "shall I." "Very well," Alain said, and turned away with an air of finality. He'd been standing with his back to a desk. Presiding over an incredibly heaped-up litter were two photographs in tarnished silver frames. One was of a lady. The other was of a young man bearing a strong resemblance to her and inscribed in a flowing hand, Ludovic. It was at this photograph that Mr. Finn had been staring. Alain said, looking at the photograph, "This is your son, sir, isn't it?" Mr. Finn, in a voice that was quite unlike his usual emphatic alto, said, "My son, Ludovic." "We have discovered that Sir Harold Lacklander died with the name Vic on his lips and full of concern about the publication of his own memoirs which he had entrusted to Colonel Carteret. We know that your son was Sir Harold's secretary during a crucial period of his administration in Slonitzer, and that Sir Harold could hardly avoid mention of the tragedy of your son's death if he was to write anything like a definitive record of his own career. I wonder if the discussion that Lady Lacklander overheard was about some such matter." Mr. Finn beat his pudgy hands together once. "If Lady L. does not care to tell you," he announced, "then neither for the time being do I." "I wonder," Alain said, "if you'd mind showing us your fishing gear." Mr. Finn stared at him. "It's not here," he said. "I'll get it. Fox will help you." Mr. Finn looked as if he didn't much relish this offer, but appeared to think better of refusing it. He and Fox went out together. Alain moved over to the book-lined wall on his left and took down Maurice Carteret's work on the Scaly Breed. He riffled through the pages. The book appeared to be a series of short essays on the behaviour and eccentricities of freshwater fish. It was illustrated rather charmingly with marginal drawings. Alain turned back to the title page and found that they were by Geoffrey Sayce. His eye fell on a page heading, "No two alike," and with astonishment he saw what at first he took to be two magnified fingerprints showing the essential dissimilarities. When, however, he looked more closely, he found written underneath, "Microphotographs, Figure 1, scale of brown trout, 6 years. Figure 2, scale of trout, 4 years, 1½ pounds. It is not perhaps generally known, the Colonel had written, that the scales of no two trout are alike, I mean microscopically alike in the sense that no two sets of fingerprints correspond. It is amusing to reflect that in the watery world a rogue trout may leave incriminating evidence behind him in the form of what might be called scales of justice. Alain replaced the book and turned to the desk with its indescribable litter. Having inspected the surface, he disclosed a letter, addressed to Octavius Finn, Esquire, in the beautiful and unmistakable handwriting of Colonel Carteret. Alain had just had time enough to discover that it contained about 30 pages of typescript marked on the outside 7, when he heard Fox's voice on the stairs. He turned away. "Here are my toys," Mr. Finn said shortly. He was evidently one of those anglers who cannot resist the call of the illustrated catalogue and the lure of the gadget. His creel, his gaff, his net, his case of flies, and his superb rod were supplemented by every conceivable toy, all of them expensive, freshly cleaned, and in wonderful order. Alain picked up a short, heavily leaded rod. "What do you call the thing?" he asked. "It's called a priest. Don't know why." "Perhaps because of its valedictory function." Alain laid it on the desk and placed Commander Seyss's arrow beside it. "I really must return this arrow to Commander Seyss," Alain said absently. "I found it in the spinney embedded in a tree trunk." He might have touched off a high explosive. The colour flooded angrily into Mr. Finn's face, and he began to shout of the infamies of Commander Seyss and his archery. The death of Thomasina Twitchett's mother at the hands of Commander Seyss was furiously recalled. Seyss, Mr. Finn said, would drink himself into a sagittal fury and fire arrows off madly into the landscape. Only last night, Mr. Finn continued, when he himself was returning from the chine, the commander's bow was twanging away, and Mr. Finn had actually heard the took of an arrow in a tree trunk dangerously near to himself. The time was 8:15. He remembered hearing his clock chime. "I think you must be mistaken," Alain put it mildly. "Nurse Kettle tells us that last evening Commander Seyss was completely incapacitated by an acute attack of lumbago." Mr. Finn shouted out a rude and derisive word. "I see," Alain said. "Do you mind if we take possession of your fishing gear for a short time? Part of a routine check, and also, I'm afraid, the shoes and suit that you wore on your fishing expedition." "Fat lot of use," Mr. Finn muttered. "If I said no." Mr. Finn's angling garments were exceedingly grubby and smelt quite strongly of fish. Alain saw, with satisfaction, a slimy deposit on the right leg of a pair of old-fashioned knickerbockers. "We won't keep you any longer," Alain said. "Unless, by any chance, you would care to give us a true account of your ramblings in the watches of the night." Mr. Finn gaped at him, and in doing so resembled for the moment the old 'un himself. "Because," Alain went on, "you haven't done so yet, you know." "I shall not make any further statements. I prefer to remain silent." "Shall I tell you what I think may have happened last night? I think that when you arrived at Hammer Farm at 1:05 this morning, you knew already that Colonel Carteret was dead. You let us understand that you returned to the bottom meadow just before you came to Hammer Farm at about 1 o'clock, but your coat was as dry as a chip, so it must have been much earlier in the evening before the rain that you returned to the bridge in the hope of retrieving the fish and found it gone. Mrs. Carteret reached Hammer Farm at about 8:05, and Dr. Lacklander went home at 8:15. Neither of them saw the trout. On my working hypothesis, then, you revisited the valley after 8:15 and, one would suppose, before 9:15 when Nurse Kettle did so. And there, Mr. Finn, in the willow grove, you found Colonel Carteret's dead body, with your mammoth trout beside it. And didn't Nurse Kettle very nearly catch you in the willow grove?" "Has she said—" "No," Alain said, "not specifically. It is I who suggest that you hid and watched her and crept away when she had gone. I suggest, moreover, that when you bolted for cover, your reading spectacles were snatched from your hat by an envious sliver, and that in your panic you dared not look for them. Then you saw the lights of Hammer Farm, and you couldn't endure the suspense of not knowing if the Colonel had been found." Alain drew a pair of spectacles from the breast pocket of his coat. "I'm afraid I can't let you have them back just yet, but—" He extended his long finger towards Mr. Finn's breast pocket. "Isn't that a magnifying glass you have managed to unearth?" Mr. Finn was silent. "Well," Alain said, "there's our view of your activities. It's a picture based on your own behaviour and 1 or 2 known facts. If it is accurate, believe me, you will be wise to say so."
You are a very clever man. I found him because of the howl of his dog."
Mr. Finn shut his eyes very tight.
"Even though his hat was over his face, I knew at a glance. I didn't go near, but I saw my fish, my super fin. And then, I heard her, Kettle, stamp, stamp, stamp past the willow grove. I ran, I flung myself on my face in the undergrowth and waited until she had gone. And then I came home," said Mr. Finn, "and, as you have surmised, I discovered the loss of my reading glasses, which I frequently kept in my hatband. I was afraid. And there you are."
"Yes," Alain said. "There we are. And you are still disinclined to tell us the full substance of your discussion with Colonel Carteret?" Mr. Finn nodded. Fox picked up the parcel of clothes. Alain said, "We'll call later for a statement, or perhaps you'd bring one to the police station in Chining this evening."
"Very well."
Mr. Finn swallowed. "Grand. We mustn't bother you any longer. Goodbye, then, until, shall we say, 5 o'clock in Chining?" They went out by a side door and down the garden to the spinney. Here Sergeant Oliphant waited for them, Alain's homicide bag beside him. At the sound of their voices he turned, and they saw that across his palms there lay a sheet of newspaper. On the newspaper were the dilapidated remains of a trout. "I got her," said Sergeant Oliphant. "She was a short piece above the bridge on the side. Cat's work, sir, as you can see by the teeth marks." "As we supposed. Now blow me down flat if this isn't the answer to the good little investigating officer's prayer." Under Oliphant's enchanted gaze, he opened his case, took from it a flat enamel dish and a small glass jar with a screw-on lid. Using his tweezers, he spread out the piece of skin with the triangular gap on the plate. From the glass jar, he took the piece of skin that had been found on the sharp stone under the Olden, muttering and whistling under his breath, and with a delicate dexterity, he pushed and fiddled the one into the other as if they were pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. They fitted exactly. "And that," Alain said, "is why Mrs. Twitchett met us last night smelling of fish, when she should have been stinking of liver. You've done damned handily, Sergeant, to pick this up so quickly. Now listen, and I'll explain." The explanation was detailed and exhaustive. Alain ended it with an account of the passage he had read in Colonel Carteret's book. "We'll send out a signal to some piscatorial pundit," he said, "and get a check, but if the Colonel was right, our two trout cannot exhibit identical scales. The Colonel's killer handled both fish." Sergeant Oliphant cleared his throat and with an air of modest achievement stooped behind a briar bush. "There's one other matter, sir. I found this at the bottom of the hill in a bit of underbrush." He straightened up. In his hand was an arrow. "It appears," he said, "to have blood on it." "Does it indeed?" Alain said, and took it. "All right, Oliphant. Damn good show. Drive Mr. Fox to the station, where he will ring the Yard and the Natural History Museum. Deliver your treasure trove to Dr. Curtis. I hope to have the rest of the exhibits before this evening. Come on, chaps. This case begins to ripen." He saw Oliphant and Fox on their way, and himself climbed up the hill to Nunsparden. Here, to his surprise, he ran into a sort of party. Shaded from the noontide sun on the terrace before the great house were assembled the 3 Lacklanders, Kitty Carteret and Rose. It was now 12:30, and a cocktail tray gave an appearance of conviviality to a singularly wretched-looking assembly. Kitty, in a tweed suit, high heels and embroidered gloves, was talking to George. Before she noticed Alain, she had completed a sentence, and he had heard it. "That's right," she said. "Briley and Brentwood." And then she saw him, and made an abrupt movement that drew all their eyes upon him. "They've been having a council of war," thought Alain.
"Well, Rory,"
Lady Lacklander shouted.
"you don't give us much peace, do you? What do you want this time? The clothes off our backs?"
"Yes," Alain said. "I'm afraid I do. The clothes off your yesterday evening backs, if you please."
"Do you mean," Lady Lacklander said, "the clothes that we were all wearing when Maurice Carteret was murdered?"
"I do, yes."
"Well," she said, "you're welcome to mine. What was I wearing yesterday?"
Mark grinned at her. "A green tent, I fancy, Gar, darling, a solar topee, and a pair of grandfather's boots."
"You're perfectly right. I'll tell my maid, Roderick, and you shall have them."
"Thank you." Alain looked at Mark. "I was wearing whites. I put brogues on for going home and carried my tennis shoes."
And your racket? Yes. And after Bottom Bridge, Lady Lacklander's sketching gear and shooting stick. That's right. And Lady Lacklander had left it all tidily packed up, hadn't she? Well, Mark said with a smile at his grandmother, more or less. Nonsense, Lady Lacklander said. There is no more or less about it. I'm a tidy woman, and I left everything tidy. Mark opened his mouth and shut it again. Your paint rag, for instance, Alain said, and Mark glanced sharply at him. I overlooked the rag, certainly, said Lady Lacklander rather grandly, when I packed up, but I folded it neatly and tucked it under the strap of my haversack. Why have you put on that look, Mark? She added crossly. Well, darling, when I got there, the rag, far from being neatly folded and stowed, was 6 yards away on a briar bush. I rescued it and put it into your haversack. They all looked at Alain as if they expected him to make some comment. He was silent, however. I wish you joy of my skirt, Mr. Alain, Kitty said unexpectedly. You won't find it very delicious. No, Alain said. Why not? It absolutely reeks of fish. I tried to take a fish away from a cat last evening. The others gaped at her. Where did you meet your cat and fish, Mrs. Carteret? This side of the bridge. Looked a perfectly good trout to me, and I thought the cat had no business with it. I thought old Ocky Finn must have hooked it and given it to the cat. He's crazy enough on his cats to give them anything, isn't he, George? Good God, yes. It's a possible explanation, Alain said, as if it didn't much matter either way. I want to know if, when I arrived, you were discussing Sir Harold Lacklander's memoirs. He knew by their very stillness that he had scored. In point of fact, we were, she said. You must have extremely sharp ears. I caught the name of my own publishers, Alain said at once. Brierley and Bentwood, an admirable firm. I'm glad you approve of them, she said dryly. I believe they are. Colonel Carteret was entrusted with the publication, wasn't he? There was a fractional pause before Mark and Rose together said, Yes, I'm glad Mr. Finn's not with us at the moment, because I want to ask you if Sir Harold gives a full account of young Finn's tragedy. Alain looked from one blankly staring face to another. Lady Lacklander said, I haven't read my husband's memoirs, nor, I think, has anyone else except Morris. Well, Alain said, I'm sorry to labour the point, but I should like to know, if you please, whether either Sir Harold Lacklander or Colonel Carteret ever said anything to any of you about the Ludovic Finn affair in connection with the memoirs. Damned if I see what you're getting at, George began. Damned if I see how you make out my father's memoirs can have anything to do with Morris Carteret's murder. Alain said, It's 18 years since young Ludovic Danbury Finn committed suicide, and a war has intervened. Many people will have forgotten his story. One among those who have remembered it, his father, must dread above all things any revival, unless, of course, it has come about that in reviving the tragedy through the memoirs, young Finn's name will be cleared. It was as if, out of a cloth that had apparently been wrung dry, an unexpected trickle was induced. George, who seemed to be the most vulnerable of the group, shouted, You've no right to assume, and got no further. Almost simultaneously, Mark and Rose said, This won't do, and were checked by an imperative gesture from Lady Lacklander. Roderick, Lady Lacklander demanded, have you been talking to Octavius Finn? Yes, Alain said. I've come straight here from Jacob's cottage. Wait a bit, Mamma, George blurted out. Wait a bit! Octavius can't have said anything otherwise, don't you see? Alain wouldn't try to find out from us. In the now really deathly silence that followed this speech, Lady Lacklander turned and blinked at her son. You ninny, George, she said. You unfathomable fool. And Alain thought he now knew the truth about Mr. Finn, Colonel Carteret, and Sir Harold Lacklander's memoirs. Alain stood up. They all jumped slightly. I expect you would like, before taking any further steps, to consult with Mr. Finn. Perhaps when you have all come to a decision you will be kind enough to let me know. They'll always take a message at the Boy and Donkey. And now, if I may, I'll get on with my job. He bowed to Lady Lacklander, was about to move off when Mark said, I'll see you to your car, sir. Coming, Rose? Mark and Rose conducted him round the east wing of the great house to the open platform in front of it. Here Fox waited in the police car. A sports model with a doctor's sticker and a more domestic car, which Alain took to be Carteret's, waited side by side.
The young footman emerged with a suitcase and delivered it to Fox. "There goes our dirty washing," Mark said, and then looked uncomfortable. He caught Rose's hand in his. "Mr. Allen," Mark said, "Rose and I are in a hell of a spot over this, aren't we, darling? We're engaged, by the way." "You amaze me," Allen said. "Well, we are, and I feel strongly that as far as you and our two families are concerned, everything ought to be perfectly straightforward. We're under promise not to mention this and that, and so we can't, but you see, sir, we happen to know that poor old Ocky Finn had every possible reason not to commit this crime." "And you agree with this, Miss Carteret?" "Mr. Allen, my father would have been appalled if he could have known that because he and Octavius had had a row over the trout, poor Ocky might be thought to have a motive. They'd had rows over the trout for years. It was a kind of joke, nothing, and whatever else they had to say to each other, and as you know there was something else, it would have made Octavius much more friendly, I promise you. You see, I'm sure he went to Ocky's because I saw him take the envelope out of the desk and put it in his pocket." She put her hand to her eyes. "But," she said, "where is it then?" Allen said. "Where exactly was the envelope? In which drawer of his desk?" "I think the bottom one on the left. He kept it locked, usually." "I see. Thank you. And of course Mr. Finn was not at home?" "No, I suppose finding him not at home, Daddy followed him down to the stream. Of course I mustn't tell you what his errand was, but if ever," Rose said in a trembling voice, "if ever there was an errand of mercy, Daddy's was one yesterday afternoon." Allen said gently, "I know. Don't worry. I can promise we won't blunder." He turned to Mark. "I think it might be a good idea if you drove Miss Carteret to Hammer Farm, where perhaps you will be kind enough to hunt up her own and Mrs. Carteret's garments of yesterday. Everything, please, shoes, stockings, and all. We'll follow you and collect them." "Fair enough," Mark said. Allen watched them get into the sports car and shoot off down a long drive. He shook his head slightly and let himself into the front seat beside Fox. "Follow them, Brer Fox," he said. "We're going to Hammer Farm." On the way, he outlined the general shape of his visit to Nun's Pardon. "Now, my dear Brer Fox, why should the Lacklanders, or Mr. Finn, or the Carterets be so uncommonly touchy about all this? I don't know what you think, but I can find only one answer." Fox turned the car sedately into the Hammer Farm drive and nodded his head. "Seems pretty obvious when you put it like that, Mr. Allen, I must say. But is there sufficient motive for murder in it?" "Who the hell's going to say what's a sufficient motive for murder? Hello, listen, who's coming?" He was out of the car before Fox could reply, and with an abrupt change of speed began to stroll down the drive. His pipe was in his hands, and he busied himself with filling it. The object of this unexpected pantomime now paddled into Mr. Fox's ken, the village postman. "Good morning," said Allen. "Morning, sir," said the postman, braking his bicycle. "I'll take them, shall I?" Allen suggested. The postman steadied himself with one foot on the ground. "Well, tar," he said. "Save the disturbance like, won't it, sir?" He fetched a long envelope from his bag and held it out. "For the deceased," he said in a special voice. "Terrible sad, if I may pass the remark." "How very kind of you," Allen said. "I'll tell them you sent your sympathy." When the postman had gone, Allen returned to Fox. "Look what I've got," he said. Fox contemplated the long envelope, and when Allen showed him the reverse side, read the printed legend on the flap. "From Brierley and Bentwood, St. Peter's Place, London, W1. "Publishers?" said Fox. "Yes. We've got to know what this is, Fox. The flap's very sketchily gummed down, a little tweak, and how easy it would be. However, we'll go the other way round. Here comes Miss Carteret." She came out, followed by Mark, carrying a suitcase, a tennis racket, in a press, and a very new golf bag and clubs. "Here you are, sir," Mark said. "Thank you," Allen said, and Fox relieved Mark of his load. Allen showed Rose the envelope. He said, "This has come for your father. I'm afraid we'll have to ask for all his recent correspondence, and certainly for anything that comes now. They will, of course, be returned and, unless used in evidence, will be treated as strictly confidential. I'm so sorry, but that's how it is. If you wish, you may refuse to let me have this one without an official order." Rose looked at it without interest. "Please take it," she said. "It's a pamphlet, I should think." Allen thanked her and watched her go off with Mark in his car. He opened the envelope, drew out the enclosure and unfolded it. Colonel M.C.V. Carteret, M.V.O., D.S.O., Hammer Farm, Swevenings. Dear Sir, the late Sir Harold Lacklander 3 weeks before he died called upon me for a discussion about his memoirs, which my firm is to publish. A difficulty had arisen in respect of Chapter 7, and Sir Harold informed me that he proposed to take your advice in this matter. He added that if he should not live to see the publication of his memoirs, he wished you, if you would accept the responsibility, to edit the work in toto. He asked me, in the event of his death, to communicate directly with you and with nobody else, and stressed the point that your decision in every respect must be considered final. We have had no further instructions or communications of any kind from Sir Harold Lacklander, and I now write in accordance with his wishes to ask if you have in fact accepted the responsibility of editing the memoirs, if you have received the manuscript, and if you have arrived at a decision in the delicate and important matter of Chapter 7. I shall be most grateful for an early reply. I am, my dear sir, yours truly, Timothy Bentwood. And I'll give you 2 guesses, Brer Fox, what constitutes the delicate and important matter of Chapter 7. At Chining Police Station, Sergeant Oliphant awaited them with 2 messages from Scotland Yard. Nice work, Alain said. Damn quick. He read aloud the first message. Information re trout scales checked with the Natural History Museum, Royal Piscatorial Society, Institute for Preservation of British Trout Streams, and Dr. S.K.M. Solomon, expert and leading authority. All confirm that microscopically your 2 trout cannot exhibit precisely the same characteristics in scales. Carteret regarded as authority. Fine, said Inspector Fox. Fair enough. Alain took up the second slip of paper. Report, he read, on the late Sir Harold Lacklander's will. He read to himself for a minute, then looked up. Couldn't be simpler, he said. With the exception of the usual group of legacies to dependents, the whole lot goes to the widow and to the son. Now for the third. Report on Commander Geoffrey Seiss, R.N., retired. Was based in Singapore, at first noticeably quiet, spent considerable time alone sketching, later cohabited with a Miss Kitty de Vere, whom he is believed to have met at a taxi dance. Seiss rented apartment occupied by de Vere, who subsequently met and married Colonel Maurice Carteret, to whom she is believed to have been introduced by Seiss. Alain dropped the chit on Oliphant's desk. Poor Carteret, he said with the change of voice. And if you like, poor Seiss. Or, from that point of view, Fox said, poor Kitty. Before they returned to Swevenings, Alain and Fox visited Dr. Curtis in the Chining Hospital mortuary. He was able to confirm that there had been an initial blow followed by a puncture. He would not entirely dismiss Commander Seiss's arrows or Lady Lacklander's umbrella spike, but he thought her shooting stick the most likely of the sharp instruments produced. The examination of the shooting stick for blood traces might bring them nearer to a settlement of this point. The paint rag undoubtedly was stained with blood, which had not yet been classified. It smelt quite strongly of fish. Alain handed over the rest of his treasure trove. Soon as you can, he said. Do like a good chap, get on to the fishy side of the business. It's a pig of a case, and on second thought, I'll keep the other arrow, the bloody one, if it is blood. What the hell can I carry it in? I don't want him to— that'll do. He slung George Lacklander's golf bag over his shoulder, wrapped up the tip of Seiss's arrow, and dropped it in. Pig of a case, he repeated. I hate its guts. Why this more than another? But Alain did not answer. He was looking at the personal effects of the persons under consideration. The Colonel's and Mr. Finn's clothes, Kitty's tweed skirt, Sir George's +4s, Lady Lacklander's sketching kit, and a pair of ancient but beautifully made brogues. Alain stopped, stretched out a hand, and lifted one of these brogues. Size about 4, he said. He turned the shoe over and was looking at the heel. It carried miniature spikes. Alain looked at Fox, who, without a word, brought from the end of the shelf a kitchen plate on which were laid out the remains of the Colonel's fish. The flap of skin, with its fragment of an impression, was carefully spread out. It'll fit all right, Alain said. Do your stuff, of course, but it's going to fit, and the better it fits, the less I'm going to like it. And with this illogical observation, he went out of the mortuary. What is biting him? Dr. Curtis asked Fox. Ask yourself, Doctor, Fox said. It's one of the kind that he's never got, as you might say, used to. Well, I'll leave you with your corpse. Seeing you, Dr. Curtis said absently. and Fox rejoined his principal. They returned to the police station where Alain had a word with Sergeant Oliphant.
"Come on, Fox, we better get moving. Oliphant, have everything laid on, and if you get a signal from me, come at once with suitable assistance."
He was very quiet on the way back over Watts Hill. As they turned the summit and approached Jacob's cottage, they saw Mr. Finn leaning over his gate with a kitten on his shoulder. Fox pulled up by the gate and Alain got out. He looked at the pallid face and restless eyes as Mr. Finn took the kitten from his neck and caressed it.
"Mr. Finn," he said, "will you let me have your copy of Chapter 7?
The kitten screamed, opening its mouth and showing its tongue. Mr. Finn kissed it and put it down.
"Forgive me, my atom," he said. "Run to Mother." He opened the gate. "Shall we go in?" he suggested, and they followed him into a garden dotted about with rustic furniture.
"Of course," Alain said. "You can refuse. I shall then have to use some other form of approach."
"Chapter 7, Mr. Finn said, wetting his lips, "constitutes for me what may perhaps be described as a contra-motive."
"So I had supposed," Alain said. "But don't you think you had better let me see it?" There was a long silence.
"Without the consent of Lady Lacklander," Mr. Finn said, "never. Not for all the sleuths in Christendom."
Mr. Finn had already turned aside when his garden gate creaked and Alain said quietly, "Good morning once again, Lady Lacklander." Mr. Finn spun round. Lady Lacklander stood blinking in the sun without expression and very slightly tremulous.
"Roderick," said Lady Lacklander, "I have come to confess."
Lady Lacklander advanced slowly towards them.
"If that contraption of yours will support my weight, Octavius," she said, "I'll take it."
They stood aside for her. Mr. Finn suddenly began to gabble.
No, not another word. I forbid it."
She let herself down on a rustic seat.
"For God's sake," Mr. Finn implored her frantically, "hold your tongue, Lady L." "Nonsense, Occy," she rejoined. "Hold yours, my good fool."
She addressed herself to Alain.
"I'm here, Roderick, virtually on behalf of my husband. The confession I have to offer is his."
"At last," Alain said. "Chapter 7.
"Precisely. I've no idea how much you think you already know, or how much you may have been told."
"By me," Mr. Finn cried out. "Nothing!"
"Humph," she said. "Uncommon generous of you, Octavius. But we are, as a family, under a certain obligation to you."
Lady Lacklander made a brief, comprehensive gesture with her short arms and said,
"Roderick, my husband was a traitor."
They made a strange group sitting there on uncomfortable rustic benches. Fox took unobtrusive notes, Mr. Finn held his head in his hands, Lady Lacklander, immobile behind the great facade of her fat, talked.
"At the time of the Zlonitzer incident, my husband was in secret negotiation with a group of Prussian fascists. He was absolutely and traitorously committed to the Nazi program."
Alain saw that her eyes were bitter with tears.
"They never found that out at your MI5, Roderick, did they?"
"No."
"And yet this morning I thought that perhaps you knew."
"I wondered, that was all."
"The extraordinary thing," Mr. Finn said suddenly, "is why? Why did Lacklander do it?"
"The Herrenvolk heresy?" Alain suggested. "An aristocratic Anglo-German alliance is the only alternative to war and communism and the only hope for the survival of his own class? It was a popular heresy at that time. No doubt he was promised great things."
"You don't spare him,"
Lady Lacklander said under her breath. "How can I? In the new Chapter 7, I imagine he doesn't spare himself."
"He repented bitterly. His remorse was frightful."
"Yes," Mr. Finn said. "That is clear enough."
"Ah, yes," she cried out. "Ah, yes, Occy, yes, and most of all for the terrible injury he did your boy. Most of all for that."
Lady Lacklander raised her voice as if she repeated some intolerable lesson.
"My husband writes that he drove Vicky Finn to his death as surely as if he had killed him with his own hands. He was instructed to do so by his Nazi masters. It was then that he began to understand what he had done and to what frightful lengths his German associates could drive him. but the treachery, Occy, was ours. Why, just now, did you try to stop me?"
"It was, if you will believe me, in deference to my boy's wishes," Finn said very quietly. "Before he killed himself, Vicky wrote to his mother and to me. He begged us to believe him innocent. He also begged us never to take any action that might injure Sir Harold Lacklander. You may not have noticed, my dear Lady Al, that my foolish boy-hero worshipped your husband. We decided to respect his wishes."
Mr. Finn stood up. He looked both old and shabby.
"Now, if I may, I shall ask you to excuse me. And if you want to know what I did with Chapter 7, I burnt it to ashes, my dear Chief Inspector, half an hour ago."
He raised his dreadful smoking cap, bowed to Lady Lacklander, and walked into his house, followed by his cats. Lady Lacklander stood up.
"I am going to Nun's pardon," she said.
Alain opened the gate. She went out without looking at him, got into her great car, and was driven away. Fox said,
"Painful business. Still, as Mr. Finn says, this Chapter 7 really puts him in the clear, as far as killing Colonel Carteret is concerned."
"Well, no," Alain said.
"No?"
"The Colonel left Chapter 7 at Jacob's cottage. Finn, on his own statement, didn't re-enter the house after his row with the Colonel. He returned to the Willow Grove, found the body, and lost his spectacles. He read Chapter 7 for the first time this morning, I fancy by the aid of a magnifying glass."
"Of course," Fox said as they turned into Commander Syce's drive. "It will have been a copy. The Colonel would never hand over the original."
"No. My guess is he locked the original in the bottom drawer on the left-hand side of his desk."
"And here we go with a particularly odious little interview. Look out for squalls, Brer Fox. Oh, gosh, see who's here."
It was Nurse Kettle. She had emerged from the front door, escorted by Commander Syce. Alain lifted his hat as Nurse Kettle shot past them like a leaping eland. She was extremely red in the face. Fox pulled up and they both got out. Alain slung the golf bag over his shoulder as he addressed himself to Syce. "May we speak to you indoors somewhere?" Alain asked. Without a word, Syce led the way into his living room, where a grim little meal was laid out on a small table in close proximity to a very dark whiskey and water.
"What's up now?"
Syce demanded. Alain said, "I've come to ask you a number of questions, all of which you will find grossly impertinent. They concern the last occasion when you were in Singapore. In a word, I must ask you if you were not in fact on terms of the greatest intimacy with Miss de Vere as she was then."
"Bloody impertinence!"
"Well, yes, but so, when one comes to think of it, is murder."
"Great grief!"
Syce exclaimed.
"I liked Carteret."
"You may have liked Carteret, but did you love his wife?"
"Love?"
Syce repeated, turning purple.
"What a word!"
"You are being difficult," Alain said without rancour. "Will you let me have the clothes you were wearing last evening?"
"What the hell for?"
"For one thing, to see if Carteret's blood is on them."
"How absolutely piffling!"
He returned and gave a bundle to Fox, who wrote out a receipt for it. "No return," Alain remarked. "Of the ailment?" Syce did not reply. Alain said, "Why the devil did you pretend to have lumbago last evening?"
"Was it for the love of a lady?"
Commander Syce's face darkened to an alarming degree. "Well, was it?" Alain insisted. Fox clapped the bundle of clothes down on a table.
"I know what it's like,"
Commander Syce began incomprehensibly. He waved his hand in the direction of Hammer Farm.
"Lonely as hell. Poor little kid. Suppose she wanted security. Natural."
He eyed the tumbler on his luncheon table.
"No good offering you a drink,"
he mumbled. "None in the world. Worse luck."
"Well,"
Syce said. He added something that sounded like luck and drained the tumbler.
"As a matter of fact," he said, "I think I'm giving it up myself. Alcohol."
He went to a corner cupboard and returned with a half-empty bottle of whiskey.
"I've got to think,"
he said. He helped himself to a treble whiskey. "In that case, wouldn't you do better without that snorter you've just poured out?"
"Think so?"
Fox, with his masterly command of the totally unexpected, said, "She would."
"She knows what to do," Commander Seiss muttered. "If she wants to stop me, or rather she doesn't, I wouldn't tell her."
Commander Seiss then added in a deeper voice than Alain would have imagined possible for him to produce,
"I wouldn't mention it to her on any account whatsoever. Never."
"I'm afraid you really are very tight."
"It's the last time so early. In future, I'm going to wait till the sun's over the yardarm. Happens to be a promise."
"To Miss Kettle?"
"Who else?"
Seiss said grandly.
"Why not?"
"An admirable idea."
"She guessed," he added wretchedly. "We parted brass rags, so I promised. After today, yardarm."
"Good luck to it." With the swiftest possible movement, Alain whisked the arrow from the golf bag and held it under Seiss's nose. "Do you know anything about that?" he asked.
"That's mine. You took it away."
"No, this was found in Bottom Meadow at the foot of Watts Hill. If you examine it, you'll see there's a difference." Alain whipped the cover off the tip of the arrow. "Look," he said. Seiss stared owlishly at the point.
"Bloody,"
he observed. "Looks like it. What blood? Whose blood?" Seiss thrust his fingers distractedly through his thin hair.
"Cat's blood," he said.
"It appears," Alain said as they drove away, "that when he's completely plastered he gets a sort of Cupid fixation and looses off his shafts blindly into the landscape with a classic disregard for their billets. Can't do anything really conclusive until we get a lead from Curtis. But we interview George Lacklander all the same, Brer Fox, and I hope lay the ghost of young Ludovic Finn. It's 1:30. We may as well let them have their luncheon. Let's see what they can do for us at the Boy and Donkey." They ate their cold meat, potato, and beetroot with the concentration of men whose meals are consumed precariously when chances present themselves. Before they had finished, Dr. Curtis rang up to give an interim report. He now plumbed unreservedly for a blow on the temple with a blunt instrument, while Colonel Carteret squatted over his catch. Subsequent injuries had been inflicted with a pointed instrument after he lay on his side, unconscious or possibly already lifeless. The second injury had all but obliterated the first. He was unable with any certainty to name the first instrument, but the second was undoubtedly the shooting stick. Traces of recently shed blood had been found under the collar of the disc. "I see," Alain said. "And the shooting stick was used, my dear chap, in the normal way, one must suppose?" "Yes, one must, mustn't one?" Alain turned away from the telephone to discover Sergeant Bailey waiting for him. He had come from a further detailed overhaul of Colonel Carteret's study. The bottom drawer on the left of the desk carried an identifiable fingerprint of Sir George Lacklander's. "Very useful," Alain said. "Brer Fox, we're going to Nunsparden." They were taken there by the yard driver, who was now released from his duties in Bottom Meadow. The butler admitted them and showed them into George Lacklander's study, the last of the studies they were to visit. George's expression was truculent. "I should have thought, I must say, Alain," he said, "that one's luncheon hour at least might be left to one." "I want," Alain said, "the truth. I want the truth about what you did yesterday evening. I want the truth about what you did when you went to Hammer Farm last night. I want the truth, and I think I have it, about Chapter 7 of your father's memoirs. Did you expect to find a copy of Chapter 7 when you broke open the drawer in Colonel Carteret's desk last night?" Lacklander made an ineffectual gesture with his hands. "I did it, at the desire of his family. The keys seemed to be lost, and there were certain things that had to be done. They thought his address book might be there. Was it there?" He boggled for a moment and then said, "No. I put it to you that it was you who insisted upon doing it because you were in a muck sweat wanting to find out where the amended Chapter 7 of your father's memoirs might be. I suggest that you are very well aware of the fact that your father wrote an amended version of Chapter 7, which was in effect a confession. In this version, he stated, firstly, that he himself was responsible for young Ludovic Finn's suicide, and secondly, that he himself had traitorously conspired against his own government with certain elements in the German government. This chapter, if it were published, would throw such opprobrium upon your father's name that in order to stop its being made public, I suggest you were prepared to go to the lengths to which you have in fact gone. You are an immensely vain man with a confused, indeed a fanatical sense of your family prestige. Have you anything to say to all this?" Most unexpectedly, George Lacklander began to laugh. "So sorry," he gasped. You don't think that I—" He waved away his uncompleted sentence with a flap of his pink freckled hand. "That you murdered Colonel Carteret, were you going to say?" "Such a notion! I mean, how? When? With what?" Alain, watching his antics, found them insupportable. I know I shouldn't laugh," Lacklander gabbled. "But it's so fantastic. How? When? With what?" And through Alain's mind dodged a disjointed jingle. "Quomodo, quando, quibus auxilius." "He was killed," Alain said, "by a blow and a stab. The injuries were inflicted at about 8:05 last evening. The murderer stood in the old punt. As for with what—" He forced himself to look at George Lacklander, whose face, like a bad mask, was still crumpled in a false declaration of mirth. "The puncture," Alain said, "was made by your mother's shooting stick, and the initial blow—" He saw the pink hands flex and stretch, "by a golf club, probably a driver." At that moment the desk telephone rang. It was Dr. Curtis for Alain. He was still talking when the door opened and Lady Lacklander came in, followed by Mark. Curtis said, "Can I talk?" "Ah, yes," Alain said airily. "That's all right. I'm afraid I can't do anything to help you, but you can go ahead quietly on your own." "I suppose," Dr. Curtis's voice said very softly, "you're in a nest of Lacklanders." "Yes, indeed." "All right. I've rung up to tell you about the scales. We can't find both types on any of the clothes or gear." "No?" "No, only on the paint rag." "Both types on that?" "Yes, and on the punt seat." "Yes?" "Yes. Shall I go on?" "Do." Dr. Curtis went on. Alain and the Lacklanders watched each other. Nurse Kettle had finished her afternoon jobs in Swevenings, but before she returned to Chining, she thought she should visit the child with the abscess in the gardener's cottage at Hammer Farm. She felt some delicacy about this duty because of the calamity that had befallen the Carterets. Still, she could slip quietly round the house and down to the cottage without bothering anybody, and perhaps the gardener's wife would have a scrap or two of mournful gossip for her about when the funeral was to take place, and what the police were doing and how the ladies were bearing up, and whether general opinion favoured an early marriage between Miss Rose and Dr. Mark. She also wondered privately what, if anything, was being said about Mrs. Carteret and Sir George Lacklander, though her loyalty to the family, she told herself, would oblige her to give a good slap-down to any nonsense that was talked in that direction. As this thought occurred to her, she heard her name called. "Hello there! Nurse Kettle!" It was Kitty Carteret, sitting out on the terrace with a tea-table in front of her. "Come and have some," she called. Nurse Kettle was dying for a good cup of tea, and what was more, she had a bone to pick with Kitty Carteret. She accepted, and presently was seated before the table. "You pour out," Kitty said. "Help yourself." She looked exhausted, and had made the mistake of over-painting her face. "What have you been doing with yourself all day, I wonder?" "Doing? God, I don't know. This morning for my sins I had to go over to Lacklander's." "To Nun's Pardon?" Nurse Kettle said with refinement. "What a lovely old home it is." "The place is all right," Kitty muttered under her breath. "Perhaps you prefer Uplands?" Kitty stared at her. "Uplands?" "I thought," Nurse Kettle said with mounting colour, "you might find the company at Uplands more to your taste than the company at Nun's Pardon." "Jeff Syce?" Kitty gave a short laugh. "God, that old bit of wreckage. Have a heart." Nurse Kettle's face was scarlet. "If the commander isn't the man he used to be," she said, "I wonder whose fault it is." "His own, I should think," Kitty said indifferently. "Personally, I found it's more often a case of chercher," Nurse Kettle said carefully, "la femme." "What?" "When a nice man takes to solitary drinking, it's generally because some woman's let him down." "Are you suggesting I'm the woman in this case?" "I'm not suggesting anything, but you knew him out in the East, I believe," Nurse Kettle added with a spurious air of making polite conversation. "Oh, yes," Kitty agreed contemptuously. "I knew him all right. Did he tell you?" Here, what has he told you? She demanded, and unexpectedly there was a note of something like desperation in her voice. Nothing I'm sure that you could take exception to. The commander, whatever you like to say, is a gentleman. How can you be such a fool? Kitty said drearily. Don't talk to me about gentlemen. I've had them, thank you. If you ask me, it's a case of the higher you go, the fewer. Look, Kitty said with savagery, at George Lacklander. Tell me this, Nurse Kettle cried out. Did he love you, the commander? Look, Kitty said, you don't know anything. You don't know a single damn thing. You haven't got a clue. You can't train for nursing, I'll have you know. Oh, well, all right, from that point of view. But from my point of view, honestly, you have no idea. I don't know what we're talking about, Nurse Kettle said in a worried voice. I bet you don't. The commander— She stopped short, and Kitty stared at her incredulously. Do I see, Kitty asked, what I think I see? You don't tell me you and Jeff Sykes— God, that's funny. Words, phrases, whole speeches suddenly began to pour out of Nurse Kettle. She had been hurt in the most sensitive part of her emotional anatomy, and her reflex action was surprising. Every word she uttered was spoken in defence of something that she would have been unable to define. It is possible that Nurse Kettle, made vulnerable by her feeling for Commander Sykes, a feeling that in her cooler moments she would have classed as unsuitable, felt in Kitty Carteret, overpainted, knowledgeable, fantastically not quite, the sting of implied criticism. It was as if by her very existence Kitty Carteret challenged the hierarchy that was Nurse Kettle's symbol of perfection. So you've no business, she heard herself saying, you've no business to be where you are and behave the way you're behaving. I don't care what's happened. I don't care how he felt about you in Singapore or wherever it was. That was his business. I don't care. When at last Nurse Kettle ran out of words and breath, Kitty turned and stared abstractedly at her. I don't know why you're making such a fuss, she said. Is he game to marry you? Nurse Kettle felt dreadful. I wish I hadn't said anything, she muttered. I'm going. I suppose he might like the idea of being dry nurse. You've nothing to moan about. Suppose I was friends with him in Singapore. What of it? Go right ahead. Mix in with the bloody county, and I hope you enjoy yourself. Don't talk about them like that, Nurse Kettle shouted. Don't do it. You know nothing about them. They're the salt of the earth. With methodical care, Kitty moved the tea tray aside, as if it prevented her in some way from getting at Nurse Kettle, and leaning forward, holding the edges of the table, said, Listen to me. I ask you to come and sit here because I've got to talk, and I thought you might be partly human. I didn't know you were a yes-girl to this gang of fossils. God, you make me sick. What have they got except money and snob value that you haven't got? Lots, Nurse Kettle declaimed stoutly. Like hell they have. Okay, I lived with your boyfriend in Singapore. He was bloody dull, but I was in a bit of a jam, and it suited us both. Okay, he introduced me to Maury. Okay, he did it like they do. Look what I found, and sailed away in his great big boat and got the shock of his life when he came home and found me next door as Mrs. Morris Carteret. So what does he do? He couldn't care less what happened to me, of course. But could he be just ordinary friendly and give me a leg up with these survivals from the Ice Age? Not he. He shies off as if I was a nasty smell and takes to the bottle. Not that he wasn't pretty expert at that before. Nurse Kettle made as if to rise, but Kitty stopped her with a sharp gesture. Stay where you are, she said. I'm talking. So here I was, married to a— I don't know what, the sort they call a nice chap. He was a real baby, though, more like a mother's darling than an experienced man. Wasn't my cup of tea, but I was down to it, and anyway, his sort owed me something. So we married and came here, and he started writing some god-awful book, and Rose and he sat in each other's pockets, and the county called. Yes, they called, all right, talking one language to each other and another one to me. Old Ocky Finn, as mad as a meat axe and doesn't even keep himself clean, the fat woman of Nun's Pardon who took one look at me and then turned polite for the first time in history. Rose, trying so hard to be nice, it's a wonder she didn't rupture something. The parson and his wife and half a dozen women dressed in tweed sacks and felt buckets with faces like the backside of a mule. My God, what have they got? They aren't fun, they aren't gay, they don't do anything, and they look like the wreck of the schooner Hesperus. Talk about a living death, and me, dumped like a sack and meant to be grateful. You don't understand, Nurse Kettle began and then gave it up. Kitty had doubled her left hand into a fist and was screwing it into the palm of the right, a strangely masculine gesture at odds with her enamelled nails. Not one of them, not a damn. One was what you might call friendly. What about Sir George? Nurse Kettle cried, exasperated and rattled into indiscretion. George? George wanted what they all want, and now things have got awkward. He doesn't want that. George, the umpteenth baronet, is in a muck sweat. George can't think, Kitty said in savage mimicry. What people might not be saying. He told me so himself. If you knew what I know about George. Her face abruptly was as blank as a shuttered house. Everything, she said, has gone wrong. I just don't have the luck. Their fault. You can say what you like, but whatever has happened is their fault. How can you think that? Miss Kettle cried out. What are you suggesting? What are you suggesting? George Lacklander demanded as Alain at last put down the receiver. Who have you been speaking to? What did you mean by what you said to me just now about— He looked round at his mother and son. An instrument, he said. Lady Lacklander said, George, I don't know what you and Roderick have been talking about, but I think it's odds on that you'd better hold your tongue. I'm sending for my solicitor. She grasped the edge of the desk and let herself down into a chair. The folds of flesh under her chin began to tremble. She pointed at Alain. Well, Rory, she demanded, what is all this? What are you suggesting? Alain hesitated for a moment and then said, At the moment, I suggest that I see your son alone. No. Mark, looking rather desperate, said, Gar, don't you think it might be better— No! She jabbed her fat finger at Alain. What have you said, and what were you going to say to George? I told him that Colonel Carteret was knocked out by a golf club. I'll now add for the information of you all, since you chose to stay here, that he was finally killed by a stab through the temple made by your shooting stick, Lady Lacklander. Your paint rag was used to wipe the scales of 2 trout from the murderer's hands. The first blow was made from the punt. The murderer, in order to avoid being seen from Watts Hill, got into the punt and slid down the stream using the long mooring rope, as you probably did when you yourself sketched from the punt. The punt, borne by the current, came to rest in the little bay by the willow grove, and the murderer stood in it, idly swinging a club at the daisies growing on the edge of the bank. This enemy of the Colonel's was so well known to him that he paid little attention, said something perhaps about the trout he had caught, and went on cutting grass to wrap it in. Perhaps the last thing he saw was the shadow of the club moving swiftly across the ground. Then he was struck on the temple. We think there was a return visit with your shooting stick, Lady Lacklander, and that the murderer quite deliberately used the shooting stick on Colonel Carteret as you used it this morning on your garden path. Placed it over the bruised temple and sat on it. What did you say? Nothing. It's a grotesque and horrible thought, isn't it? We think that on getting up and releasing the shooting stick there was literally a slip, a stumble, you know. It would take quite a bit of pulling out. There was a backward lunge, a heel came down on the Colonel's trout. The fish would have slid away, no doubt, if it had not been lying on a sharp, triangular stone. It was trodden down and, as it were, transfixed on the stone. A flap of skin was torn away, and the foot, instead of sliding off, sank in and left an impression of the spiked heel of a golf shoe. George Lacklander said in an unrecognizable voice, All this conjecture! No, Alain said, I assure you not conjecture. He looked at Lady Lacklander and Mark. Shall I go on? Lady Lacklander, using strange uncoordinated gestures, fiddled with the brooches that, as usual, were stuck about her bosom. Yes, she said, go on. Mark, who throughout Alain's discourse had kept his gaze fixed on his father, said, "Go on. By all means, why not?" "Right," Alain said. "Now the murderer was faced with evidence of identity. One imagines the trout glistening with a clear spiked heel mark showing on its hide. It wouldn't do to throw it into the stream or the willow grove and run away. There lay the colonel with his hands smelling of fish and pieces of cut grass all around him. For all his murderer knew, there may have been a witness to the catch. This, of course, wouldn't matter as long as the murderer's identity was unsuspected, but there is a panic sequel to most crimes of violence, and it is under its pressure that the fatal touch of over-cleverness usually appears. I believe that while the killers stood there fighting down terror, the memory of the Olden lying on Bottom Bridge arose. Hadn't Danbury Finn and the colonel quarrelled loudly, repeatedly, and vociferously quarrelled that very afternoon over the Olden? Why not replace the colonel's catch with the fruits of Mr. Finn's poaching tactics and drag not a red herring, but a whacking great trout across the trail? Would that not draw attention towards the known enemy and away from the secret one? So, there was a final trip in the punt. The colonel's trout was removed and the Olden substituted. It was at this juncture that fate, in the person of Mrs. Thomasina Twitchett, appeared to come to the murderer's aid. "For God's sake!" George Lacklander shouted. "Stop talking!" He half-formed an extremely raw epithet, broke off and muttered something indistinguishable. "Who are you talking about, Rory?" Lady Lacklander demanded. "Mrs. who?" "Mr. Finn's cat. You will remember Mrs. Carteret told us that in Bottom Meadow she came upon a cat with a half-eaten trout. We have found the remains. There is a triangular gash corresponding with the triangular flap of skin torn off by the sharp stone, and as if justice or nemesis or somebody had assuaged the cat's appetite at the crucial moment, there is also a shred of skin bearing the unmistakable mark of part of a heel and the scar of a spike." "But can all this," Mark began, "I mean, when you talk of correspondence—" "Our case," Alain said, "will, I assure you, rest upon scientific evidence of an unusually precise character. At the moment I'm giving you the sequence of events. The colonel's trout was bestowed upon the cat. Lady Lacklander's paint rag was used to clean the spike of the shooting stick and the murderer's hands. You may remember, Dr. Lacklander, that your grandmother said she had put all her painting gear tidily away, but you, on the contrary, said you found the rag caught up in a briar bush." "You suggest, then," Mark said evenly, "that the murder was done sometime between 10 to 8 when my grandmother went home and 8:15 when I went home." He thought for a moment, and then said, "I suppose that's quite possible. The murderer might have heard or caught sight of me thrown down the rag in a panic and taken to the nearest cover only to emerge after I'd picked up the sketching gear and gone on my way." Lady Lacklander said after a long pause, "I find that a horrible suggestion. Horrible!" "I dare say," Alain said. "It was an abominable business, after all." "You spoke of scientific evidence," Mark said. Alain explained about the essential dissimilarities in individual fish scales. "It's all in Colonel Carteret's book," he said, and looked at George Lacklander. "You had forgotten that, perhaps." "Matter of fact, I don't know that I ever read poor old Morris's little book." "It seems to me to be both charming," Alain said, "and instructive. In respect to the scales, it is perfectly accurate. A trout scale, the Colonel tells us, are his diary, in which his whole life history is recorded for those who can read them. Only if two fish have identical histories will their scales correspond. Our two sets of scales, luckily, are widely dissimilar. There is Group A, the scales of a 9- or 10-year-old fish who has lived all his life in one environment. And there is Group B, belonging to a smaller fish who, after a slow growth of 4 years, changed his environment, adopted possibly a sea-going habit, made a sudden spurt of growth, and was very likely a newcomer to the chine. You will see where this leads us, of course." "Damned if I do," George Lacklander said. "Oh, but yes, surely. The people who, on their own and other evidence, are known to have handled one fish or the other are Mr. Finn, Mrs. Carteret, and the Colonel himself. Mr. Finn caught the Olden. Mrs. Carteret tells us she tried to take a fish away from Thomasina Twitchett. The Colonel handled his own catch and refused to touch the Olden. Lady Lacklander's paint rag with the traces of both types of fish scales tell us that somebody, we believe the murderer, handled both fish. The further discovery of minute bloodstains tells us that the spike of the shooting stick was twisted in the rag after being partially cleaned in the earth. If, therefore, with the help of the microscope, we could find scales from both fish on the garments of any one of you, that one will be Colonel Carteret's murderer. That, Alain said, was our belief. Was, Mark said quickly, and Fox, who had been staring at a facetious Victorian hunting print, refocused his gaze on his senior officer. Yes, Alain said. The telephone conversation I've just had was with one of our Home Office men who are looking after the pathological side. It is from him that I got all this expert stuff about scales. He tells me that on none of the garments submitted are there scales of both types. The normal, purplish colour flooded back into George Lacklander's face. "I said from the beginning," he shouted, "it was some tramp, that why the devil you had to—" He seemed to hunt for a moderate word. "To put us through the hoops like this." His voice faded. Alain had lifted his hand. "Well?" Lacklander cried out. "What is it? What the hell is it?" "I beg your pardon, Mamma," Lady Lacklander said automatically. "Don't be an ass, George." "I'll tell you," Alain said, "exactly what the pathologist has found. He has found traces of scales where we expected to find them on the Colonel's hands and the edge of one cuff, on Mr. Finn's coat and knickerbockers, and, as she warned us, on Mrs. Carteret's skirt. The first of these traces belongs to Group B, and the other two to Group A. Yes?" Alain said, looking at Mark, who had begun to speak and then stopped short. "Nothing," Mark said. No, go on." "I've almost finished. I've said that we think the initial blow was made by a golf club, probably a driver. I may as well tell you at once that so far none of the clubs has revealed any trace of blood. On the other hand, they have all been extremely well cleaned." George said, "Naturally, my chap does mine." "When it comes to shoes, however," Alain went on, "it's a different story. They too have been well cleaned, but in respect of the right foot of a pair of golfing shoes there is something quite definite. The pathologist is satisfied that the scar left on the Colonel's trout was undoubtedly made by the spiked heel of this shoe." "It's a bloody lie!" George Lacklander bawled out. "Who are you accusing? Whose shoe?" "It's a handmade job, size 4, made, I should think, as long as 10 years ago, from a very old, entirely admirable and hideously expensive bootmaker in the Burlington Arcade. It's your shoe, Lady Lacklander." Her face was too fat to be expressive. She seemed merely to stare at Alain in a meditative fashion. But she had gone very pale. At last she said without moving, "George, it's time to tell the truth." "That," Alain said, "is the conclusion I hoped you would come to." "What are you suggesting?" Nurse Kettle repeated, and then, seeing the look in Kitty's face, she shouted, "No, don't tell me." But Kitty had begun to tell her. "It's each for himself in their world," she said, "just the same as in anybody else's. If George Lacklander dreams he can make a monkey out of me, he's going to wake up in a place where he won't have any more funny ideas. What about the old family name, then? Look! Do you know what he gets me to do? Break open Morris's desk because there's something Morrie was going to make public about old Lacklander, and George wants to get in first. And when it isn't there, he asks me to find out if it was on the body. Me! And when I won't take that one on, what does he say? I don't know, don't tell me." "Oh, yes, I will. You listen to this and see how you like it. After all the fun and games teaching me how to swing." She made a curious little retching sound in her throat and looked at Nurse Kettle with a kind of astonishment. "You know," she said, "golf. Well, so what does he do? He says this morning when he comes to the car with me, he says he thinks it would be better if we don't see much of each other." She suddenly flung out a string of adjectives that Nurse Kettle would have considered unprintable. "That's George Lacklander for you," Kitty Carteret said. "You are a wicked woman," Nurse Kettle said. "I forbid you to talk like this. Sir George may have been silly and infatuated. I dare say you've got what it takes, as they say. And he's a widower. And I always say there's a trying time for a gentleman just as there is— But that's by the by. What I mean, if he's been silly, it's you that's led him on," Nurse Kettle said, falling back on the inexorable precepts of her kind. "You court our dear Colonel, and not content with that, you set your cap at poor Sir George. You don't mind who you upset or how unhappy you make other people. I know your sort. You're no good.
No good at all. I shouldn't be surprised if you weren't responsible for what's happened. Not a scrap surprised."
"What the hell do you mean?" Kitty whispered. She curled back in her chair and, staring at Nurse Kettle, she said, "You with your poor Sir George. Do you know what I think about your poor Sir George? I think he murdered your poor dear Colonel, Miss Kettle." Nurse Kettle sprang to her feet. The wrought iron chair rocked against the table. There was a clatter of china, and a jug of milk overturned into Kitty Carteret's lap. "How dare you!" Nurse Kettle cried out. "Wicked! Wicked! Wicked!" She heard herself grow shrill, and in the very heat of her passion she remembered an important item in her code: never raise the voice. So, although she would have found it less difficult to scream like a train, she did contrive to speak quietly. Strangely commonplace phrases emerged, and Kitty, slant-eyed, listened to them. "I would advise you," Nurse Kettle quavered, "to choose your words. People can get into serious trouble passing remarks like that." She achieved an appalling little laugh. "Murder the Colonel," she said, and her voice wobbled desperately. "The idea! If it wasn't so dreadful it'd be funny. With what, may I ask, and how?" Kitty, too, had risen, and milk dribbled from her ruined skirt to the terrace. She was beside herself with rage. "How?" she stammered. "I'll tell you how, and I'll tell you with what. With a golf club and his mother's shooting stick, that's what. Just like a golf ball it was. Bold and shining, easy to hit, or an egg. Easy!" Kitty drew in her breath noisily. Her gaze was fixed not on Nurse Kettle, but beyond Nurse Kettle's left shoulder. Her face was stretched and stamped with terror. It was as if she had laid back her ears. She was looking down the garden towards the spinney. Nurse Kettle turned. The afternoon was far advanced, and the men who had come up through the spinney cast long shadows across the lawn, reaching almost to Kitty herself. For a moment, she and Alain looked at each other, and then he came forward. In his right hand he carried a pair of very small, old-fashioned shoes, brogues with spikes in the heels. "Mrs. Carteret," Alain said, "I'm going to ask you if, when you played golf with Sir George Lacklander, he lent you his mother's shoes. Before you answer me, I must warn you." Nurse Kettle didn't hear the usual warning. She was looking at Kitty Carteret, in whose face she saw guilt itself.
"George," Lady Lacklander said to her son, "we shall, if you please, get this thing straightened out. There must be no reservations before Mark or—"
She waved her fat hand at a singularly still figure in a distant chair.
"or Octavius. Everything will come out later on. We may as well know where we are now among ourselves. There must be no more evasions."
George looked up and muttered, "Very well, Mamma."
"I knew, of course," his mother went on, "that you were having one of your elephantine flirtations with this wretched, unhappy creature. I was afraid that you'd been fool enough to tell her about your father's memoirs and all the fuss over Chapter 7. What I must know now is how far your affair with her may be said to have influenced her in what she did."
"My God," George said, "I don't know."
"Did she hope to marry you, George? Did you say things like, 'if only you were free,' to her?"
"Yes," George said, "I did." He looked miserably at his mother and added, "You see, she wasn't. So it didn't seem to matter." Lady Lacklander snorted, but not with her usual brio.
"And the memoirs? What did you say to her about them?"
"I just told her about the damned Chapter 7. I just said that if Maurice consulted her, I hoped she'd sort of weigh in on our side, and when that was no use, I said that if he did publish, it'd make things so awkward between the families that we, well—"
"All right, I see. Go on."
"She knew he had the copy of Chapter 7 when he went out. She told me that afterwards, this morning. She said she couldn't ask the police about it, but she knew he'd taken it." Lady Lacklander moved slightly. Mr. Finn made a noise in his throat.
"Well, Ockie?"
she said. Mr. Finn, summoned by telephone and strangely acquiescent, said, "My dear Lady Al, I can only repeat what I've already told you. Had you all relied on my discretion, as I must acknowledge Carteret did, there would have been no cause for anxiety on any of your parts over Chapter 7.
You have behaved very handsomely, Archie.
No, he said. Believe me, no.
Yes, you have. You put us to shame. Go on, George.
I don't know that there is anything more, except—
Answer me this, George. Did you suspect her?
George put his great elderly hand across his eyes and said,
I don't know, Mamma. Not at once. Not last night. Not this morning. She came by herself, you know. Mark called for Rose. I came downstairs and found her in the hall. It seemed queer, as if she'd been doing something odd.
From what Rory tells us, she'd been putting my shoes that you'd lent her without my leave in the downstairs cloakroom,
Lady Lacklander said grimly.
I am completely at a loss, Mr. Finn said suddenly.
Naturally you are, Archie.
Lady Lacklander told him about the shoes.
She felt, of course, that she had to get rid of them. They're the ones I wear for sketching when I haven't got a bad toe, and my poor fool of a maid packed them up with the other things. Go on, George.
Later on, after Alain had gone and you went indoors, I talked to her. She was sort of different, said poor George. Well, damned hard. Sort of almost suggesting— Well, I mean, it wasn't exactly the thing.
I wish you would contrive to be more articulate. She suggested that it wouldn't be long before you'd pay your addresses.
And then— I suppose I looked a bit taken aback. I don't know what I said, and then— but it was pretty frightful. She sort of began, not exactly hinting, but, well—
Hinting,
Lady Lacklander said, will do. That if the police found Chapter 7, they'd begin to think that
Yes, George, we understand. Motive.
It really was frightful. I said I thought it would be better if we didn't sort of meet much. It was just that I suddenly felt I couldn't. Only that. I assure you, Mamma. I assure you, Octavius.
Yes, she said. All right, George.
And then when I said that, she suddenly looked— George said this with an unexpected flash— like a snake.
And you, my poor boy, his mother added, looked no doubt like the proverbial rabbit.
Well, I feel like I've behaved like one anyway, George rejoined with a unique touch of humour.
You've behaved very badly, of course, his mother said without rancour. You've completely muddled your values, just like poor Morris himself, only he went still further. You led a completely unscrupulous trollop to suppose that if she was a widow you'd marry her. You would certainly have bored her even more than poor Morris. But Archie will forgive me if I suggest that your title and your money and Nun's pardon offered sufficient compensation. You may on second thoughts even have attracted her, George, his mother added. I mustn't, I suppose, underestimate your simple charms.
She contemplated her agonized son for a few minutes and then said,
It all comes to this, and I said as much to Kettle a few days ago when we were talking. We can't afford to behave shabbily, George. We've got to stick to our own standards, such as they are, and we daren't muddle our values. Let's hope Mark and Rose between them will pick up the pieces.
She turned to Mr. Finn.
If any good has come out of this dreadful affair, Archie, she said, it is this. You have crossed the Chine after I don't know how many years, and paid a visit to Nun's pardon. God knows we have no right to expect it. We can't make amends, Archie. We can't pretend to try, and there it is. It's over, as they say nowadays, to you.
She held out her hand, and Mr. Finn, after a moment's hesitation, came forward to take it. You see, Oliphant, Alain said with his customary air of diffidence. At the outset it tied up with what all of you told me about the Colonel himself. He was an unusually punctilious man, oddly formal, the Chief Constable said, and devilishly polite, especially with people he didn't like or had fallen out with. He'd fallen out with the Lacklanders. One couldn't imagine him squatting on his haunches and going on with his job if Lacklander or his mother turned up in the punt. or old Finn, with whom he'd had a flaring row. Then, as you and Gripper pointed out, the first injury had been the sort of blow that is struck by a quarryman on a peg projecting from a cliff face at knee level, or by an underhand service, or, you might have added, by a golfer. It seemed likely, too, that the murderer knew the habit of the punt, and the contracurrent of the chine, and the fact that where the punt came to rest in the Willow Grove Bay, it was completely masked by trees. You will remember that we found one of Mrs. Carteret's distinctive yellow hairpins in the punt in close association with a number of cigarette butts, some with lipstick and some not. "Ah," Sergeant Oliphant said. "Dalliance, no doubt." "No doubt. When I floated down the stream into the little bay and saw how the daisy heads had been cut off and where they lay, I began to see also a figure in the punt idly swinging a club. A figure so familiar to the Colonel that after an upward glance and a word of greeting, he went on cutting grass for his fish. Perhaps, urged by George Lacklander, she asked her husband to suppress the alternative version to Chapter 7, and perhaps he refused. Perhaps Lacklander, in his infatuation, had told her that if she was free, he'd marry her. Perhaps anger and frustration flooded suddenly up to her savage little brain, and down her arms into her hands. There was that bald head, like an immense exaggeration of the golf balls she had swiped at under Lacklander's infatuated tuition. She had been slashing idly at the daisies. Now, she made a complete backswing, and in a moment her husband was curled up on the bank with the imprint of her club on his temple. From that time on, she became a murderess fighting down her panic, and frantically engaged in the obliteration of evidence. The print of the golf club was completely wiped out by her nightmare performance with the shooting stick, which she had noticed on her way downhill. She tramped on the Colonel's trout, and there was the print of her spiked heel on its hide. She grabbed up the trout and was frantic to get rid of it when she saw Mr. Finn's cat. One could imagine her watching to see if Thomasina would eat the fish, and her relief when she found that she would. She'd seen the old un on the bridge. No doubt she heard at least the fortissimo passages of Finn's quarrel with the Colonel. Perhaps the old un would serve as false evidence. She fetched it and put it down by the body, but in handling the great trout, she let it brush against her skirt. Then she replaced the shooting stick. Lady Lacklander's painting rag was folded under the strap of her rucksack. Kitty Carteret's hands were fishy. She used the rag to wipe them. Then, although she was about to thrust the shooting stick back into the earth, she saw, probably round the collar of the spike, horrible traces of the use she had made of it. She twisted it madly about in the rag, which was, of course, already extensively stained with paint. No doubt she would have refolded the rag and replaced it, but she heard, may even have seen, Dr. Lacklander. She dropped the rag and bolted for cover. When she emerged, she found he had taken away all the painting gear. Alain paused and rubbed his nose. "I wonder," he said, "if it entered her head that Lady Lacklander might be implicated. I wonder exactly when she remembered that she herself was wearing Lady Lacklander's shoes." He looked from Fox to Oliphant and the attentive Gripper. "When she got home," he said, "no doubt she at once bathed and changed. She put out her tweed skirt to go to the cleaners. Having attended very carefully to the heel, she then polished Lady Lacklander's shoes. I think that heel must have worried her more than anything else. She guessed that Lacklander hadn't told his mother he'd borrowed the shoes. As we saw this morning, she had no suitable shoes of her own, and her feet are very much smaller than her stepdaughter's. She drove herself over to Nun's Pardon this morning, and instead of ringing, walked in and put the shoes in the downstairs cloakroom. I suppose Lady Lacklander's maid believed her mistress to have worn them, and accordingly packed them up with her clothes instead of the late Sir Harold's boots, which she had actually worn." Fox said, "When you asked for everybody's clothes, Mrs. Carteret remembered, of course, that her skirt would smell of fish." "Yes. She'd put it in the box for the dry cleaning. When she realized we might get hold of the skirt, she remembered the great trout brushing against it. With a mixture of bravado and cunning, which is, I think, very characteristic, she boldly told me it would smell of fish, and had the nerve and astuteness to use Thomasina as a sort of near-the-truth explanation. She only altered one fact. She said she tried to take a fish away from a cat, whereas she had given a fish to a cat. If she'd read her murdered husband's book, she'd have known that particular cat wouldn't jump, and the story was, in fact, a bit too fishy. The scales didn't match." Oliphant said suddenly, It's a terrible thing to happen in the Vale. Terrible the things that'll come out. How's Sir George going to look?" "He's going to look remarkably foolish," Alain said with some heat, "which is no more than he deserves. He's behaved very badly, as his mother has no doubt pointed out to him. What's more, he's made things beastly and difficult for his son, who's a good chap, and for Rose Carteret, who's a particularly nice child. I should say Sir George Lacklander has let his side down. Of course, he was no match at all for a woman of her hardihood. He'd have been safer with a puff-adder than Kitty Carteret, nay, heaven help her, De Vere." "What, sir, do you reckon—" Oliphant began, and catching sight of his superior's face was silent. Alain said harshly, "The case will rest on expert evidence of a sort never introduced before. If her counsel is clever and lucky, she'll get an acquittal. If he's not so clever and a bit unlucky, she'll get a lifer." He looked at Fox. "Shall we go?" he said. He thanked Oliphant and Gripper for their work and went out to the car. Oliphant said, "Something upset the chief, Mr. Fox?" "No, don't you worry. It's the kind of case he doesn't fancy. Capital charge and a woman. Gets to thinking about what he calls first causes." "First causes?" Oliphant repeated dimly. "Society, civilization, or something," Fox said. "Mustn't keep him waiting. So long." Darling Rose," Mark said, "we're in for a pretty ghastly time, I know, but we're in for it together, my dearest love. And I'll watch over you and be with you, and when it's all done with, we'll have each other and love each other more than ever before, won't we? Won't we?" "Yes," Rose said, clinging to him. "We will, won't we?" "So that something rather wonderful will come out of it all," Mark said. "I promise it will. You'll see. As long as we're together." "That's right," Mark said. "Being together is everything." And with one of those tricks that memory sometimes plays on us, Colonel Carteret's face, as Mark had last seen it in life, rose up clearly in his mind. It wore a singularly compassionate smile. Together, they drove back to Nun's Pardon. Nurse Kettle drove in bottom gear to the top of Watts Hill and there paused. On an impulse, or perhaps inspired by some unacknowledged bit of wishful thinking, she got out and looked down on the village of Swevenings. Dusk had begun to seep discreetly into the valley. Smoke rose in cosy plumes from one or two chimneys. Roofs cuddled into their surrounding greenery. It was a circumspect landscape. Nurse Kettle revived her old fancy. "As pretty as a picture," she thought wistfully, and was again reminded of an illustrated map. With a sigh, she turned back to her faintly trembling car. She was about to seat herself when she heard a kind of strangulated hail. She looked back, and there, limping through the dusk, came Commander Seiss. The nearer he got to Nurse Kettle, the redder in the face they both became. She lost her head slightly, clambered into her car, turned her engine off, and turned it on again. "Pull yourself together, Kettle," she said, and leaning out shouted in an unnatural voice, "The top of the evening to you!" Commander Seiss came up with her. He stood by the open driving window, and even in her flurry she noticed that he no longer smelt of stale spirits. "Ha ha!" he said, laughing hollowly. Sensing perhaps that this was a strange beginning, he began again. "Look here," he shouted. "Good Lord, I just heard. Sickening for you. Are you all right? Not too upset and all that. What a thing." Nurse Kettle was greatly comforted. She had feared an entirely different reaction to Kitty Carteret's arrest in Commander Seiss. "What about yourself?" she countered. "Must be a bit of a shock to you, after all." He made a peculiar dismissive gesture with the white object he carried. "Never mind me, or rather," Commander Seiss amended, dragging feverishly at his collar, "if you can bear it for a moment." She now saw that the object was a rolled paper. He thrust it at her. "There you are," he said. "It's nothing, whatever. Don't say a word." She unrolled it, peering at it in the dusk. "Oh," she cried in an ecstasy. "How lovely! How lovely! It's my picture map! Oh, look! There's Lady Lacklander sketching in Bottom Meadow,
and the doctor with a stalk over his head. Aren't you a trick? And there's me! Only you've been much too kind about me. She leant out of the window, turning her lovely map towards the fading light. This brought her close-ish to Commander Seiss, who made a singular little ejaculation and was motionless. Nurse Kettle traced the lively figures through the map. The landlord, the parson, various rustic celebrities. When she came to Hammer Farm, there was the gardener's cottage and his child, and there was Rose bending gracefully in the garden. Nearer the house one could see even in that light, Commander Seiss had used thicker paint. As if, Nurse Kettle thought with a jolt, there had been an erasure, and down in the willow grove, the Colonel's favourite fishing haunt, there had been made a similar erasure.
"I started it," he said, "some time ago after your first visit."
She looked up, and between this oddly assorted pair, a silence fell.
"Give me 6 months,"
Commander Seiss said,
"to make sure it'll be all right. Will you?"
Nurse Kettle assured him that she would.